Hello, my friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if these stories have been keeping you company, a like helps more than you would probably guess. And if you want more nights like this one, waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. What I would genuinely love to know is where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're tucked into a quiet bedroom somewhere in Richmond, Virginia, with the air conditioner humming steadily behind the wall. Maybe you're curled up by an open window in a small town outside Bristol, England, a fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to stir the warm night air around you. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, always. All right, love, let your shoulders drop. Let's go. Tonight, we're stepping into 1776, the year everyone remembers for independence, but almost no one truly knows what daily life actually looked like for common families living through it. And we're going to look at the things they had to do back then and considered completely unremarkable. Baking an entire week's worth of bread in a single afternoon, because heating the oven was too costly a task to repeat every single day. Burying an entire winter's food supply underground in a root cellar, because there was no refrigerator, no freezer, nothing but cold, steady earth to keep a family fed until spring finally came. Sharing a single bed with nearly the whole family through the coldest months, not for lack of space, but simply because that was the only way to keep everyone warm enough to make it through the night. Things that would stop a modern family cold. We're not opening in Independence Hall tonight. The kitchen is dark. That is the first thing worth knowing about a colonial morning. Dark in a way you have probably never actually experienced. Not streetlight dark, not phone screen dark, an absolute animal darkness, broken only by a bed of orange coals under a bank of grey ash in the hearth. Somewhere in that darkness a woman is already awake, and she has been awake, if we are honest, for some minutes before her feet ever touch the floor, lying still and listening to the house, the way you might listen to a familiar person breathing beside you. Maybe she is 26 years old and has borne 3 children, 2 of whom are asleep in the loft above her right now. Maybe she's 51 and has buried a husband and remarried a widower with 4 children of his own, so that the house she wakes in is a stitched-together thing, half her children, half his, all of them somehow hers now, in the particular way that colonial households absorbed loss and simply kept moving. Maybe she's 19, newly married, still learning which floorboard near the door creaks loud enough to wake the baby. Here is the detail that stops people cold when I first came across it, and I want to hand it to you gently, because it is worth sitting with. In the summer of 1776, while men in Philadelphia debated the exact wording of a document that would eventually be read in every town square in the colonies, most of the women whose sons and husbands would carry that document's consequences into war for the next 7 years could not read it themselves. Not because they were incapable, because almost nobody had thought to teach them. A woman could run a household that functioned as a small factory, a farm, a school, and a hospital all at once, and still be told, gently, by the culture around her, that her signature on a legal paper meant nothing without a man's name attached to it. That is the paradox sitting quietly under everything I am about to tell you tonight. The women who kept the entire machinery of colonial life running were, in the eyes of the law that machinery served, barely visible at all. Fire is the first task of every colonial day, and it is not a small one. Nobody in 1776 strikes a match because the match as you know it does not exist yet and will not for another 60 years. What exists instead is a tinderbox, a little tin container kept always in the same spot near the hearth, holding a flint, a piece of steel, and a nest of charred linen rag that catches a spark the way dry grass catches lightning. She kneels on the cold hearthstone in the dark, feeling for the box with hands that already know exactly where it sits, and strikes the steel against the flint again and again, until a spark finally lands true in the scorched cloth and begins, very faintly, to glow. That glow gets coaxed, not rushed. A twist of birch bark first, because birch bark burns even when everything else in the woodpile is damp, then thin kindling, then, only once there is real flame, the split logs that will carry the fire through the day, if she's careful, and she has learned to be. She will not need to start a fire from nothing very often at all. The real skill of a colonial hearth is banking it correctly the night before, burying the coals under enough ash that they smoulder quietly until morning without ever fully dying. A house that lets its fire go out entirely is a house that has to walk to a neighbour's hearth and carry embers home in a covered pan, which is embarrassing in the particular, quiet way that small domestic failures are embarrassing in a community where everyone notices everything. And here is a detail I find genuinely delightful. In some New England towns, there were people paid a small fee to walk the streets before dawn specifically to relight fires for households whose coals had died overnight. A fire carrier, essentially, going door to door in the dark with a covered pot of live embers, like a strange gentle version of a milkman delivering warmth instead of milk. By the time the fire has real flame, there is usually a little grey light coming through whatever window the house has, and windows in 1776 are a genuine luxury item. Small, few, sometimes glazed with actual glass if the family has money, sometimes covered with oiled paper that lets in a milky kind of light and nothing else. Glass was expensive enough that many rural households simply did without it in certain rooms, which tells you something about how differently colonial people experienced the passage of a day. Darkness was not an inconvenience to be switched away. It was simply most of the day, for most of the year, for most people. Now she wakes the children, and this part of the morning has its own quiet choreography. The youngest sleep with her, often in the same bed, or trundled out on a low frame that slides beneath the main bedstead during the day to save floor space. Older children sleep in the loft, reached by a ladder more than a staircase, where the roof slopes down close enough to the bed that you learn very quickly which side you can sit up on without knocking your head. In winter that loft is genuinely, seriously cold, cold enough that children sometimes wake with a thin skin of frost on the wool blanket where their breath has settled overnight. Nobody finds this remarkable. It is simply February. Hygiene, that morning, looks almost nothing like what you're picturing. There is no running water anywhere in this house. None. Not a single tap in the entire colony that year, so washing means a basin and a pitcher, water carried in from the well the evening before and left to sit overnight, still holding a faint chill from the ground it came out of. She splashes her face. She wets a corner of cloth and wipes her neck, behind her ears, under her arms. A full bath, the kind where a person submerges an entire body in water, happens rarely, sometimes only a handful of times a year, and this is not neglect, it is practicality. Heating enough water for a proper bath means feeding the fire for an hour or more, hauling that water in buckets, and then hauling it back out again afterward. An enormous amount of labour for a single person's comfort, in a household where labour is the scarcest resource of all. What colonial people actually relied on for cleanliness was something closer to what we would now call dry washing, a daily wipe down with cloth and water focused on the parts of the body that actually accumulate dirt and odour, combined with frequent changes of linen. And this is the detail that genuinely surprises most people because it runs backward from how we think about hygiene today. The outer layer of clothing, the wool gown or the linen coat, was rarely washed at all, sometimes not for months, because wool in particular does not tolerate frequent washing well in this period, and dries slowly enough to become a health hazard in a damp climate. What got washed, constantly, almost obsessively by the standards of the outer clothes, was the linen worn directly against the skin. The shift a woman wore under her gown, the shirt a man wore under his waistcoat. These were changed daily if the household could manage it, because the thinking of the period, and it was not wrong, held that linen against the skin absorbed sweat and oil and could simply be swapped out and laundered, doing the actual work of keeping a person clean while the wool overlayer stayed on for days or weeks at a stretch, essentially odourless by comparison because it was never the layer touching skin. Teeth got their own small ritual, usually a rag dipped in salt or in a chalky tooth powder, sometimes made at home from ground cuttlefish bone or burnt bread, rubbed over the teeth and gums before the household's water supply got used for anything else that morning. Dentistry as an emergency service existed, provided by barbers, blacksmiths, and the occasional itinerant tooth puller who travelled between towns with a bag of frankly terrifying iron instruments, but preventative dental care in any sense we would recognise did not, and a colonial smile, even a well-cared-for one, told a story about diet and age that modern dentistry has largely erased from human faces. Getting dressed, for a colonial woman, is not the quick act you are picturing either. It is a sequence, layer by layer, each piece serving a purpose the modern eye has mostly forgotten how to read. First, the shift, that linen undergarment we already mentioned, worn to protect the outer clothes from the body as much as the body from the cold. Over that stays a fitted garment stiffened with strips of whalebone or sometimes reed, laced up the back or the front depending on style and whether there is a second pair of hands available to help. Stays get an unfair reputation today, mostly because people confuse them with the much more extreme corsetry that would come a full century later. Colonial stays, worn correctly, were closer to a firm, supportive undergarment than an instrument of torture, providing back support for a body that was about to spend 12 or 14 hours standing, bending, lifting and carrying. Ask any woman who did farm labour in stays for a full pregnancy, and she will likely tell you the garment did some real, unglamorous work. Over the stays, a petticoat, sometimes 2 or 3 depending on the season, and over that the gown itself, the outer dress, often made of wool for warmth or linen for the summer heat, dyed whatever colour the household's dye pot could achieve that year. And here is where 1776 becomes suddenly, specifically political in a way that touches the most mundane act of a woman's mourning. Cloth, in the years leading up to this one, had become a battlefield of its own. British taxes on imported goods, and the boycotts organised in response to them, meant that homespun cloth spun and woven inside the colonies rather than shipped from English mills, had become something close to a badge of patriotic loyalty. Groups of women calling themselves the Daughters of Liberty organised spinning bees, sometimes drawing dozens of women to a single house for a day of spinning flax and wool into thread, turning what had always been solitary domestic labour into something that looked, for the first time, almost like public political participation. A woman putting on a homespun gown that morning in 1776 was, whether she thought about it in these terms or not, making a small daily statement about which side of an enormous argument she stood on. That is not a detail you find in most classroom versions of this year, and I find it worth sitting with for a moment. The revolution was being fought, in part, in the choice of fabric on a woman's back. Stockings next, wool or linen, held up with garters tied just above or below the knee, and then shoes, if the household could afford shoes that fit properly, which not every household could. Children in particular often went barefoot through the warmer months well into their teens, not from cruelty but from simple economics. Shoes were expensive and children's feet grew faster than most families could afford to replace them. A pocket, and this detail always makes people smile when I mention it, was not sewn into the dress at all in this period, but was instead a separate little bag tied around the waist under the petticoats, accessed through a slit in the skirt seam. Women carried their pocket's contents, a thimble, a few coins, a folded letter, a stray bit of ribbon, in this hidden pouch riding against the hip, invisible to anyone looking at the finished outfit, a small private compartment built into the architecture of getting dressed. The cap goes on last, nearly always, indoors and out, for married women in particular. Bare hair on a grown married woman, in public, in most of the colonies in 1776, would have read the way walking outside without shoes reads today, not scandalous exactly, but noticeably, conspicuously incomplete. The cap served practical purposes too, keeping hair out of cooking fires and away from dirt, but its social weight mattered just as much as its usefulness. A woman's hair under that cap was often not washed for weeks at a stretch, a fact that sounds alarming to modern ears, and would have seemed entirely unremarkable to hers, because the hair itself was rarely fully exposed to dirt or sweat the way it is when worn loose, and because washing hair thoroughly required once again that same enormous investment of heated water that made full bathing so rare. She would brush it, work bear grease or a bit of pomade through it if she had any, and pin it up under linen before most of her household was even fully awake. Downstairs, or more likely in the single main room that the whole family shares, because most colonial farmhouses in 1776 are not the sprawling multi-room homes you might be imagining. The fire is now steady, and the real cooking work of the morning has begun. And this is where I want to slow down, because the hearth, more than almost anything else in this story, was the true engine of a colonial household, and understanding how it worked tells you almost everything about how these people actually lived. There is no stove in this house. There will not be a stove in most American kitchens for another 60 or 70 years. Everything, absolutely everything, gets cooked over or beside an open fire, using a collection of iron tools that a colonial woman knew the way you know the buttons on your phone, without thinking, by feel. A crane, an iron arm bolted into the side of the hearth, swings pots over the flame and swings them back out again, adjustable in height by a series of hooks called trammels, so that a stew can simmer gently on a lower hook while bread bakes in a higher heat nearby. A spider, which is simply a skillet standing on 3 short legs, sits directly in the coals raked out onto the hearthstone rather than hanging over the main fire at all. A Dutch oven, a heavy-lidded iron pot, gets buried partway in coals, with more coals shoveled on top of its flat lid, baking bread or biscuits from both directions at once, in something close to a primitive version of your own oven at home. Breakfast that morning is probably not what you are picturing either. Forget bacon and eggs as a daily standard. That is a later, wealthier invention. For most ordinary colonial families in 1776, breakfast means some form of corn, because corn, unlike wheat, grows reliably across almost the entire range of colonial climates and soils, and had become by this point the true backbone grain of American cooking in a way wheat never quite managed outside a few specific regions. Mush, a thick porridge of cornmeal boiled in water or milk, appears on tables from Massachusetts to Georgia that morning, sometimes sweetened with a little molasses if the household has any, sometimes eaten plain with a splash of milk poured over it, sometimes fried the next day in leftover slices if there was extra from the night before, a dish some households called scrapple depending on the region and what got mixed into it. Here is a detail that genuinely surprised me the first time I came across it. Coffee, which we now think of as an almost universal American breakfast habit, was in 1776 a deeply specifically political beverage, and not always for good supply reasons. Tea had been the default hot drink across the colonies for generations, inherited straight from British custom, but the tax on tea and the boycotts that followed had made drinking tea in some patriot households something close to a small act of treason against the cause. Households sympathetic to independence began switching, sometimes with real reluctance, to coffee instead, or to what got called Liberty tea, an improvised brew made from dried raspberry leaves, sage, or other herbs grown in a kitchen garden, an attempt to keep the ritual of a hot morning drink alive without funding the crown that was taxing it. Imagine giving up your actual preferred drink, the one you genuinely like the taste of, because drinking it has become a political statement you are no longer willing to make. That is what was happening at breakfast tables across the colonies that year, quietly, without anyone writing a declaration about it. Milk, when the household kept a cow, which most rural families did, appeared fresh in the morning, warm still from the milking that had happened just before or during the fire building. Bread, if there was any left from the last baking day, which happened perhaps once or twice a week rather than daily, because heating a full brick oven built into or beside the hearth was too much fuel and labor to justify every single morning. And eggs, when the hens were laying, which in colonial New England meant reliably in spring and summer and sparsely, sometimes not at all, through the darker months of winter, because hens without artificial light simply lay far less when the days shorten, a seasonal rhythm to something as basic as breakfast that modern grocery store shelves have almost entirely erased from our collective memory. The children eat standing mostly, or perched on stools too low for the table's height, because chairs, real chairs with backs, were often reserved for the head of the household and perhaps a guest, while everyone else made do with benches, stools, or simply the edge of a chest. Utensils were their own small drama. Forks existed by 1776, but were still, in many households, a relatively new and somewhat suspect import, considered by some older or more rural families to be an affectation unnecessary when a knife, a spoon, and your own fingers had done the job perfectly well for generations. Children in particular often ate with their hands well into an age where you might expect a fork to have appeared, simply because fingers required no washing beyond what the family was already doing, and no risk of a small child stabbing themselves or a sibling at a crowded table. And here, quietly, in the middle of all this ordinary morning noise, the youngest child might already be strapped into something that would look, to modern eyes, deeply strange: a standing stool, a little wooden frame that held a toddler upright and contained, keeping them safely near the fire's warmth but away from its actual flame, while their mother's hands were occupied elsewhere. Some households used a go-kart instead, an early wheeled walker meant to help a child learn to stand and move without constant supervision from an adult who genuinely did not have a spare set of hands to offer. Childcare, in this world, was rarely a dedicated activity. It happened around and inside the labor of everything else. A baby watched from the corner of an eye while bread got kneaded. A toddler's cries answered mid-stir of a pot that could not simply be left because leaving it meant burning the one meal the household would eat that morning. Children, once breakfast is cleared, do not simply go play, not in the way you might picture a modern child's morning unfolding. Childhood, as an extended, protected stretch of years devoted mostly to learning and play, was not really a concept colonial families would have recognized the way we understand it now. A child of 5 or 6 was already expected to carry small loads of kindling, feed chickens, watch a younger sibling, or run simple errands between the house and the barn. By 8 or 9, a girl might be spinning thread for an hour or more each day, a genuinely tedious, repetitive task requiring more patience than most modern 8-year-olds are ever asked to summon. And a boy of the same age might be old enough to help drive livestock, weed a garden row, or split kindling with a hatchet sized for smaller hands. This is not, I want to be careful to say, a story of universal cruelty toward children. It reflects a world where every pair of hands in a household, no matter how small, represented real economic value the family genuinely needed, and where most parents believed, sincerely and not unkindly, that useful work built character and prepared a child for the only kind of adult life available to them. Play absolutely existed too, and it existed in forms that would look surprisingly familiar if you saw them today. Marbles made of clay or stone, hoops rolled along dirt paths with a stick, a rough early version of what we would now call tag or hide and seek, played among barns and stone walls and the edges of tobacco or wheat fields. Dolls for girls, sometimes elaborate if the family had money, sometimes nothing more than a corn husk twisted and tied into a rough human shape, which children, being children in every century, loved with the same ferocity as any store-bought toy. Education that morning looked wildly different depending on where in the colonies you happened to be born, and this regional difference is one of the details most classroom summaries flatten into a single simple story that was never actually true. In New England, thanks to a set of laws going back over a century that required towns of a certain size to maintain a schoolmaster, literacy rates were genuinely high, among the highest in the entire world at that moment in history, for boys at least, and increasingly for girls as well, though girls' education still typically stopped well short of what boys received and focused more heavily on reading than on writing or arithmetic. A dame school, run informally out of an older woman's own kitchen for a small fee, often provided a young child's very first exposure to letters taught from a hornbook, a single wooden paddle with the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer pasted on it and covered with a thin transparent sheet of animal horn to protect the paper from small sticky fingers. Travel south into Virginia or the Carolinas, and the picture shifts considerably. Formal schools were far rarer outside the larger towns, and wealthier planter families often relied instead on private tutors living in the household, while poorer white families and the enslaved population, who were in most southern colonies explicitly forbidden by law from being taught to read at all, existed on entirely different educational tracks that had almost nothing in common with each other or with the New England model. A child's access to literacy in 1776, in other words, depended enormously on an accident of geography and birth that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with which colony and which family they happened to be born into. The tools of learning, where learning happened at all, were sparse by any modern standard. Paper was expensive enough that children practiced writing on slates, thin grey stone tablets that could be wiped clean and reused indefinitely with a wet rag. The sound of chalk scratching across slate, a genuinely common noise in any colonial classroom, one that has almost entirely vanished from the modern world. Ink, when it was needed for a more permanent lesson, was often made at home from oak galls, those strange round growths you sometimes find on oak leaves, boiled down with iron filings into a dark, slightly bitter-smelling liquid that stained fingers for days after use. And discipline, in these small colonial schoolrooms, was not gentle by any measure we would recognize as acceptable today. A birch rod hung visibly in many classrooms, used without much hesitation for both academic errors and simple misbehavior, a practice that would have struck almost no one in 1776 as remarkable, because corporal punishment was simply woven into the fabric of how adults were expected to correct children in nearly every setting, at home as much as at school. I do not say this to shock you. I say it because it is worth understanding honestly how differently this era thought about the relationship between a child and the adults responsible for shaping them. Water, meanwhile, needs fetching, and this is a task that recurs so many times across a colonial day that it is worth pausing on properly, because it shapes the entire architecture of domestic labor in a way that is easy to overlook from the comfort of a house with taps in every room. A well sits somewhere near the house, sometimes just outside the door if the family was fortunate in where they built, sometimes a genuine walkaway if the underlying rock or soil made a closer well impossible to dig. A full bucket of water is heavy, genuinely heavy, somewhere near 40 pounds once you account for the container itself, and a household of 6 or 7 people uses an enormous quantity of it across a single day, for cooking, for washing, for the animals, for the garden in a dry spell. This meant that fetching water was not a single morning chore, checked off and forgotten. It was a current running underneath the entire day, a trip made again and again, usually by whichever woman or older child happened to be free at that particular moment, the wooden yoke across the shoulders if the household had one, balancing 2 buckets at once to save a return trip. Some women could carry water this way for years without spilling a drop, a skill built entirely from repetition, the body learning a rhythm of walking that kept the surface of the water calm. Laundry, when laundry day arrived, usually once every week or two rather than daily, was arguably the single most physically punishing task in the entire colonial domestic calendar, and I want you to actually sit with what it involved, because I think it recalibrates something in how we understand the phrase women's work. Water first, hauled in the quantities we just discussed, heated over the fire in a large kettle, because cold water simply could not lift grease and dirt from heavily worn linen and wool the way hot water could. Soap, often made at home in a laborious, faintly dangerous process involving rendered animal fat and lye leached from wood ash, a substance strong enough to burn skin if handled carelessly, which meant laundry day carried a real, if usually minor, physical risk alongside its sheer exhausting labor. The clothes themselves got scrubbed against a washboard, or simply pounded with a wooden bat called a beetle, wrung by hand with enough force to genuinely strain forearms and shoulders, then rinsed, wrung again, and hung to dry, weather permitting, or draped near the fire on days when rain made outdoor drying impossible. A single laundry day, for a family of average size, could occupy an entire woman's labor from before dawn until well past dark, and it is genuinely no exaggeration to say that many colonial women dreaded this day the way you might dread a task you know will leave your whole body sore for 2 days afterward. Some communities, in an early flicker of the collective female labor we already saw in the spinning bees, occasionally shared this burden between households on a rotating basis, though this was far from universal and depended heavily on how closely neighbors lived and how well they got along. Soap making itself deserves its own small mention, because it happened only once or twice a year, usually in the autumn after the fall butchering had produced a store of animal fat, and it filled the entire farmyard with a smell that anyone who grew up near a working colonial-style household will tell you they can still recall decades later. Sharp, faintly acrid, not unpleasant exactly, but unmistakable, carrying for what felt like a considerable distance on a still day. Dairy work, if the household kept a cow or two, which the majority of rural families did, added its own daily rhythm layered on top of everything else. Milking happened twice a day, morning and evening, by hand, a skill that took real practice to do efficiently without exhausting your forearms or upsetting an animal that could, with one badly timed kick, undo 20 minutes of careful work in a single second. The milk, once collected, got strained through cloth to remove any stray hair or debris, and then most of it went not toward drinking, but toward butter and cheese, because raw milk in a world without refrigeration turned quickly, especially in summer heat, and preserving its value meant transforming it into something that could last. Churning butter was its own long, monotonous labor. A wooden dasher plunged up and down inside a tall churn for what could stretch to 40 minutes or more before the cream finally, almost mysteriously, separated and thickened into butter, a moment that colonial women described across countless letters and diaries with something close to genuine relief, because until that separation happened, you genuinely could not know how long the churning would take that particular day, and a stubborn batch could leave your arms trembling long after the butter finally, gratefully, came together. Cheese-making went further still, and if you have never watched it happen, the process is stranger and more alchemical than you might expect. Rennet, an enzyme drawn from the lining of a calf's stomach, got added to warmed milk to curdle it, separating the solid curds from the liquid whey, and those curds got pressed, salted, and set aside to age in a cool cellar or springhouse for weeks or months before they became anything resembling the cheese you would recognize on a table. A springhouse, for households fortunate enough to have a natural spring nearby, was a small stone structure built directly over running water, using the Earth's steady underground temperature as a kind of primitive refrigeration, keeping milk, cheese and butter cool through even the hottest stretches of a Virginia or Carolina summer. It is, when you actually think it through, a genuinely elegant piece of engineering, achieved with nothing but stone and an understanding of where cold water naturally ran. Out past the dairy work, the kitchen garden waited, and this small plot of ground, usually fenced against deer and free-ranging livestock, mattered enormously to a colonial family's survival in a way that modern backyard vegetable patches, grown mostly for pleasure, do not quite capture. Cabbages, turnips, onions, beans, squash and herbs, for both cooking and home remedies, filled these beds, tended almost entirely by women, who also carried in their heads an enormous, largely unwritten body of knowledge about which plant treated which ailment, knowledge passed down mother to daughter across generations with no textbook involved at all. Sage for a sore throat, chamomile to settle a fretful stomach or help a restless child finally sleep, plantain, the common weed, not the fruit, crushed and applied directly to a bee sting or a small cut, something children in this era learnt to recognize and use themselves by the time they were 7 or 8 years old, a piece of practical botany that has almost entirely vanished from how modern children understand the natural world around them. Yarrow to help stop bleeding, feverfew, as the name rather bluntly suggests, for fevers. This kitchen garden medicine cabinet mattered enormously because a doctor in 1776 was a genuinely rare and often genuinely dangerous resource, and I want to spend a real moment on what colonial medicine actually looked like, because it explains so much about how these families understood risk, illness, and the fragility of a single human life. There was no germ theory yet. Nobody in this world understood that invisible organisms caused disease, and the dominant medical framework, inherited from centuries of European tradition, still revolved around the idea of 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, that needed to stay in balance for a person to remain healthy. An illness meant, in this framework, that one humour had grown excessive, and the most common treatment, bleeding a patient by opening a vein and letting blood flow into a bowl, was meant to restore that balance. It sounds, from where you are lying right now, almost unbearably crude, and in many cases it genuinely was, weakening patients who were often already dangerously weak to begin with. And yet the people practicing it were not fools or monsters. They were working with real seriousness and real care for their patients inside the best framework their era had given them, the same way you and I operate every day inside medical understanding that people 200 years from now will very possibly find equally difficult to comprehend. Childbirth, specifically, sat almost entirely outside the reach of formal university-trained medicine in 1776, and this is worth understanding clearly because it overturns a lot of assumptions people carry into this era. A midwife, not a doctor, attended the overwhelming majority of colonial births, and she was, in her own community, often one of the most respected and trusted women in the entire town, called on at every hour of the night, in every season, expected to travel in weather that would keep most other people firmly indoors. A skilled, experienced midwife might attend hundreds of births across a working lifetime, carrying an enormous accumulated store of practical knowledge about labor, positioning, and complications that had nothing to do with formal medical training and everything to do with decades of direct, hands-on experience. It carried genuine mortal risk too, this era's childbirth, both for the mother and for the infant, in numbers that are genuinely sobering to sit with. Something in the range of 1 in 8 women who survived to childbearing age would eventually die as a direct result of pregnancy or childbirth complications across their lifetime, a statistic that meant almost every woman in 1776 had personally known someone, a sister, a neighbor, a mother, who had died this way. Infant mortality ran even higher, with something close to 1 in 10 babies not surviving their very first year, and disease claiming still more before they reached adulthood. A colonial mother, by the time she had raised several children into adulthood, had very often also buried at least one child along the way, a grief so statistically common that it shaped the entire emotional architecture of family life in ways we can only partly reconstruct from letters and diaries that survive today, often written in a tone of grief so restrained it almost reads as calm, not because the loss hurt less, but because the culture around these women had taught them, out of sheer necessity, how to keep functioning through a kind of sorrow that would completely derail most modern lives. While all of this unfolds inside and around the house, the men of the household are, most likely, already out in the fields, and it is worth pausing here to actually picture what that work looked like, because farming in 1776 bears almost no resemblance to farming as any modern person would recognize it. There are no machines. Every single task, from breaking the soil to bringing in the harvest, happens through the combined effort of human muscle and animal strength, an ox or a horse pulling a wooden plow that a man walks behind, both hands gripping the handles, steering it through soil that fights back with every root and stone it contains. Corn, wheat, rye, oats, and depending on the colony, tobacco, indigo, or rice occupied the fields, and the specific crop grown told you a great deal about which colony you were standing in and what kind of economy that colony's entire existence had been built around. In the Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland, tobacco dominated everything, an exhausting crop that depleted soil quickly, required constant attention across nearly the entire growing season, and had shaped, over more than a century, an entire social and economic order around its cultivation, an order that by 1776 relied overwhelmingly on the forced uncompensated labor of enslaved Africans and African Americans, a fact so central to daily colonial reality in that region that any honest account of the era has to look at it directly rather than glancing past it. I want to speak plainly here, because this channel exists to tell true stories, not comfortable ones. Slavery was not a distant institution confined to plantation ballrooms and grand estates. In 1776, roughly 1 in 5 people living in the 13 colonies was enslaved, and in some southern colonies that proportion climbed considerably higher, meaning enslaved men, women, and children were doing an enormous share of the actual physical labor that kept colonial agriculture and colonial households functioning at all. Their days began before dawn and ended well after dark. Their labor was stolen from them entirely. Their families could be separated at the will of an owner with no legal recourse whatsoever, and their own domestic lives, the small rituals of food and clothing and child-rearing we have been walking through tonight, happened under conditions of surveillance and control that stripped away almost every choice a free colonial family, however poor, still retained. An enslaved woman rose before her own household's fire had even properly caught, prepared food for people who owned her, nursed children who were not always only her own, and then, if any hours remained after the labor demanded of her, tried to build some small semblance of family and rest for herself and the people she loved, often in a single-room cabin with a dirt floor, using whatever meager rations and cast-off materials her circumstances allowed. Their resilience, their music, their food traditions, their medicine, much of it drawn from West African knowledge carried across an ocean under conditions almost impossible to fully comprehend, would go on to shape American culture in ways that are still being properly acknowledged centuries later. I say this not to darken your evening unnecessarily, but because leaving it out would make everything else in this story a lie of omission, and this channel would rather sit with a hard truth for a few honest minutes than skip past it for the sake of easier rest. Further north, in New England and the middle colonies, farms tended to be smaller, more mixed, growing a variety of grains and vegetables alongside raising livestock, worked more often, though not exclusively, by free farmers and their own families, sometimes assisted by hired laborers or indentured servants, people who had traded a fixed number of years of labor, often between 4 and 7, in exchange for passage across the Atlantic, room and board, a system that carried its own real hardships and abuses, even as it differed in fundamental legal ways from the permanent, inherited, race-based bondage of chattel slavery further south. A man's work in the field followed the seasons with an unforgiving rhythm. Spring meant plowing and planting, timed with real anxiety around the last frost, because plant too early and a late cold snap could destroy an entire season's crop. Plant too late and the growing window shortened dangerously. Summer meant weeding, endless weeding, done by hand or with a simple hoe, bent over rows of crops under a sun that offered no relief and no modern sunscreen, wearing a broad-brimmed straw hat if the family could afford one specifically for that purpose. Harvest, in late summer and early autumn, was the most intense stretch of the entire agricultural year, requiring every available hand, children included, working from first light until the light genuinely failed, because a crop left too long in the field risked rain damage, frost, or simple spoilage that could mean genuine hunger through the coming winter. Not every colonial man farmed, of course, and town life, in the smaller cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, offered a genuinely different daily rhythm built around trades rather than fields. A blacksmith's day began with building his forge fire hot enough to soften iron, a physically brutal job in summer, standing close to flames that could reach temperatures hot enough to make the surrounding air shimmer, hammering horseshoes, tools, hinges, and nails, because nails, remarkably, were often made one at a time by hand in this period, a task tedious enough that it was frequently assigned to apprentices, or even, in some households, to children, as a way of contributing a small but genuine income to the family. Down the street, a cooper spent his days building barrels, an enormously important trade in a world that shipped, stored, and transported almost everything, from flour to gunpowder to salted fish, inside wooden barrels built with a precision that modern people rarely appreciate. Curved staves shaped and fitted so tightly together with iron hoops that the finished barrel could hold liquid without a single drop escaping. No glue, no nails in the main body at all. Just wood shaped and tensioned into a shape that held itself together through pure structural cleverness. A cordwainer made shoes. A tanner turned raw animal hides into usable leather through a process involving urine and animal brains that smelled, by every surviving account, genuinely horrific, which is why tanneries were almost always situated at the edge of town, downwind, as far from the main streets as the town's layout allowed. Apprenticeship structured almost the entire world of skilled trade in 1776. A boy, typically somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14, would be formally bound, often through a legal document, to a master craftsman for a period of years, usually until he turned 21, living inside that master's household, working under his direct supervision, learning the trade in exchange for room, board, and the promise of skill that would eventually let him set up his own shop. This arrangement gave the master considerable, sometimes genuinely uncomfortable authority over a young person who was not, technically, his own child, and the quality of an apprentice's experience varied enormously depending entirely on the character of the particular master he had been bound to, a kind of legal and economic dependency that placed enormous trust and enormous risk in the hands of whichever household a young boy happened to land in. Girls, in town settings, occasionally apprenticed as well, most commonly in trades considered suitably feminine, millinery, mantua-making, which meant dressmaking, or occasionally printing, if a father or widowed mother ran a print shop and needed extra hands. Benjamin Franklin's own sister, incidentally, had wanted desperately to work in printing herself, a trade she watched her brothers learn while she was steered instead toward domestic work, a small specific example of the much larger pattern we have already touched on tonight, talent and interest existing in a young woman that the world around her simply had no formal channel prepared to receive. Let's step back outside now, for a moment, and into the wider rhythm of a colonial town on an ordinary day in 1776, because there is something worth noticing in how differently sound moved through this world compared to the one you are lying in right now. No engines, no electrical hum. What you would have heard, walking down a dirt street in Boston or Williamsburg that morning, was the specific, layered soundscape of muscle and craft, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil carrying for blocks in the still morning air, the creak of cartwheels on rutted dirt roads, a rooster somewhere, a dog barking at nothing in particular, the low murmur of two neighbors talking over a fence, church bells marking the hours in towns where a church tower happened to have one, because clocks, genuinely accurate personal clocks, were rare and expensive enough that most ordinary people told time by the sun, by church bells, or simply by the rhythm of the tasks that structured their day, rather than by any specific numbered hour at all. Midday brought what colonial households usually called dinner, not lunch, a term that had not yet come into common use, and this meal, not the evening one, was typically the largest and most substantial of the day, eaten whenever the sun sat roughly overhead, whatever that translated to on a given household's informal internal clock. Field workers came in from the heat, or a wife carried food out to them directly if the field sat too far from the house to make the walk back worthwhile, wrapped in cloth, carried in a basket balanced against her hip, sometimes with a young child trailing along beside her, delighted simply to be outside and moving rather than confined near the hearth. A pot of stew, likely, had been simmering over the fire since morning, because the beauty of a hearth fire, once it existed at all, was that it could be tending several things across many hours with only occasional attention. A piece of salted pork or beef added early, root vegetables from the garden or the root cellar going in as the morning progressed, thickened perhaps with a handful of dried beans or barley. Meat itself was a genuinely precious resource, and I want to correct something people often assume about this era, that colonial families ate enormous quantities of fresh meat regularly. They did not most of them, not most days. Fresh meat required either slaughtering an animal, a significant event that produced far more meat than a family could eat before it spoiled, or hunting, which took time away from the constant, unglamorous labor of the farm itself. What this meant in practice was an entire preserved food economy running quietly in the background of colonial life, one that shaped flavor and texture in ways almost completely foreign to modern palates. Salt pork, packed into barrels layered thick with salt, could last through an entire winter, though it required soaking before cooking to draw out enough of that salt to make it edible rather than simply painful. Smoked and dried meats, hung in a smokehouse that filled the yard with a low, constant, faintly sweet wood smoke smell for days at a time whenever a fresh batch was curing. Salted fish, especially in New England where cod fishing had become a genuine economic pillar of the regional economy, dried on wooden racks along the coast until it turned hard and pale, needing a long soak of its own before it became soft enough to cook into a chowder or a pie. Root cellars, dug into the earth beneath the house or nearby, held the harvest through winter. Potatoes, turnips, cabbages, carrots, and onions layered in sand or straw to slow their spoiling, the temperature underground staying reliably cool and stable across seasons, in a way that above-ground storage never could. A family's entire winter survival, quite literally, depended on how carefully and thoughtfully this root cellar had been packed in the autumn, and a poor harvest or a badly managed store could mean genuine hunger by February or March, the so-called hungry gap that colonial families across every region learnt to dread and plan around with real seriousness. Bread, when it appeared, had usually been baked once or twice a week in a large batch. The family's brick beehive oven, built into or beside the main hearth, fired up with a substantial armload of wood burned down to coals. Those coals then swept out entirely before the actual loaves went in, the retained heat in the brick itself doing the slow, even baking work over the following hours. A skilled colonial baker judged that oven's readiness not with a thermometer, because accurate kitchen thermometers did not yet exist for home use, but by holding a hand inside the empty oven and counting how many seconds she could bear the heat before pulling it back. A genuinely elegant, entirely intuitive piece of practical physics passed down through pure repetition and experience. Pies, in this era, served a purpose you might not expect, functioning as much as a preservation method as a dessert. A thick pastry crust sealed meat, or fruit, or vegetables inside an airtight shell that helped the filling last considerably longer than it would exposed to open air, meaning a pie baked on a Monday might still be entirely edible, even good, by Thursday or Friday, sliced cold and eaten straight from the pantry shelf without any need to reheat it. A genuinely practical piece of food technology disguised as a comfort food. Now let us slow down here for a moment and talk about how the revolution itself, the enormous historical event you already know the outline of, actually arrived into a day that otherwise looked exactly like everything we have just described. It did not arrive the way a modern news event arrives, all at once, on every screen simultaneously. It arrived slowly, unevenly, in fragments, carried by riders on horseback and by newspapers that might be a week or two old by the time they reached a rural farm far from the coastal cities where most printing happened. A broadside, a single large printed sheet, might get nailed to the door of the local tavern or the meeting house or a designated public post in the town square, and within it lay whatever news had most recently travelled up from Philadelphia or down from Boston, sometimes genuinely urgent, sometimes weeks stale by the time anyone in a smaller inland town actually read it. Literacy, remember, was not universal, especially outside New England, which meant that in many towns, someone, often the local minister, the schoolmaster, or simply whoever in the crowd could read most confidently, would read these broadsides aloud to a gathered group, the news arriving communally as a spoken performance in front of neighbors rather than a private act of reading alone. Word of mouth carried enormous weight in this information ecosystem, and it traveled with the ordinary rhythms of colonial life, through a trip to the mill to have grain ground, through a Sunday gathering at the meeting house, through the tavern where men gathered in the evening to drink, argue, and trade whatever news a recent traveller had brought through town. And here is something worth sitting with. In the summer of 1776 specifically, the actual text of the Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on the 4th of July, took genuine time to reach the wider population. It was read publicly for the first time in Philadelphia on July 8th, a few days after its formal adoption, and from there it spread outward in a slow ripple, town by town, sometimes taking weeks to reach the more remote corners of the colonies, meaning that for a meaningful stretch of that particular summer, some colonial families were going about entirely ordinary days, tending gardens, minding children, milking cows, completely unaware that their nation, or at least the document that would eventually define its founding, already existed. For most ordinary colonial families, the revolution was experienced less as an idea and considerably more as a series of very immediate, very practical disruptions to daily life. Militia musters pulled men away from fields at exactly the moments those fields most needed tending, meaning wives, mothers, and older daughters found themselves suddenly responsible for the full physical labor of a farm that had previously required every able-bodied adult the household contained. Imagine the arithmetic of that moment. A woman who already worked from before dawn until after dark, now also ploughing, or supervising the ploughing, or making decisions about planting and harvest timing that had always previously belonged to her husband's judgment rather than her own. Many women rose to this challenge with a competence that surprised even themselves, a shift in daily responsibility that, in its own quiet way, planted seeds of confidence and capability that would ripple forward across the following decades. Long after the specific crisis of 1776 had passed, shortages became a genuine daily reality as well. British naval blockades disrupted trade along the coast, meaning imported goods that colonial households had relied on for generations. Certain fabrics, particular spices, specific tools and manufactured items grew scarce or simply vanished from what few shops existed. Prices for what remained climbed with a speed that alarmed even people who had lived through earlier periods of colonial economic hardship, and this inflation touched every single meal, every piece of clothing, every candle burned that summer, a slow, grinding pressure that most classroom histories skip past in favor of battles and speeches, but which shaped the actual daily experience of ordinary people far more directly than any single military engagement did. Salt, in particular, became a genuinely serious point of anxiety because salt was essential to the entire preservation system we described earlier, and much of the colony's salt had traditionally been imported. A shortage of salt was not an abstract economic inconvenience. It threatened a family's entire capacity to preserve meat and fish through the coming winter, and colonial newspapers from this period are full of both genuine worry and increasingly creative local solutions, including boiling seawater along the coast in an attempt to produce homemade salt at a scale that could never fully replace what trade had once supplied. The Daughters of Liberty, whom we touched on earlier in the context of homespun cloth, deserve a slightly deeper look here, because their organizing represents one of the very first instances of American women engaging in something recognizable as coordinated political action, even though almost none of them would have described it in those terms themselves. Spinning bees, which sound almost quaint from a modern distance, functioned as genuinely significant public gatherings, sometimes drawing 30, 40, even more women to a single home or meeting house for a full day of spinning thread from raw flax and wool, competing good-naturedly over who could produce the most or the finest thread. The finished product then donated toward clothing colonial soldiers, or simply toward reducing the community's collective dependence on British imported cloth. These gatherings mattered for reasons beyond the thread itself. They gave women a legitimate, socially acceptable reason to assemble in large numbers outside the usual context of church, and in doing so they created space for political conversation, for the exchange of news, for a kind of collective identity forming among women who had previously experienced political life almost entirely through the men in their households. A newspaper account from this period, describing one such gathering in Massachusetts, noted with what reads today as genuine, slightly startled admiration that a group of women had spun and woven enough cloth in a single day to produce several complete garments, framing the achievement explicitly in patriotic terms, as a contribution to the cause every bit as real in its own domestic register as anything happening on a battlefield. Boycotts of British goods more broadly relied enormously on women's cooperation to actually function, because women were the ones making the daily purchasing decisions inside most households, choosing which tea to buy or not buy, which cloth to select, which imported goods to simply do without. A woman's decision, at her own kitchen table, to serve Liberty tea instead of British tea, or to dress her children in homespun rather than imported fabric, was a genuinely meaningful economic act at scale, multiplied across thousands of households making similar daily choices, and colonial leaders organizing resistance to British policy understood this well enough to explicitly appeal to women as essential participants in the boycott movement, publishing pledges and public letters specifically addressed to female readers, asking them to commit to abstaining from British goods as a matter of principle and patriotism. Now, let me pull you back gently into the smaller, quieter scale of an ordinary evening, because for all the enormous historical weight sitting in the background of this particular year, most hours of most days for most colonial families still passed in the same unremarkable rhythm they always had. The sun, by late afternoon, begins its long, slow decline, and the household's attention turns, as it always does, toward supper, toward bringing the animals in, toward the specific small tasks that mark the close of a working day. Chickens get shut into their coop against foxes and other nighttime predators. Cows come in from pasture for evening milking, udders full and heavy after a full day of grazing. Tools get gathered from wherever the day's work left them and returned to the barn or the shed, because leaving good iron tools out overnight in a damp climate invited rust that could ruin an implement a family might not easily be able to replace. Water gets fetched one more time, likely for the evening's cooking and the household's overnight needs. Supper itself tended to be lighter than the midday dinner, often built from whatever remained from earlier in the day. A bit of the stew reheated, bread and cheese, perhaps a bowl of milk for the youngest children. Families ate together, generally gathered around whatever table the household owned, and mealtime conversation, in an era with no radio, no television, no printed material reaching most households more than once a week if that, functioned as one of the primary channels through which news, gossip, and simple daily observation actually moved between generations. A father might recount whatever he had heard at the mill or the tavern that day. A mother might mention a neighbor's illness, a birth, a piece of livestock that had wandered off and needed watching for. Grace, a short prayer of thanks before eating, was nearly universal across colonial households of nearly every religious background, though its exact wording and length varied considerably depending on denomination and region. New England households, shaped heavily by their Puritan and Congregationalist inheritance, tended toward longer, more formal prayers, sometimes extending to a genuine minute or more of thanksgiving and reflection before a single fork, or more likely a single hand, touched the food. Households further south, or in the more religiously diverse middle colonies, home to Quakers, Anglicans, Lutherans, and a genuinely wide range of other traditions, brought over by successive waves of immigration, often kept grace considerably shorter and simpler. Sunday, across nearly the entire colonial world regardless of specific denomination, structured the week in a way that modern secular life has mostly lost track of. Work largely stopped, or was at minimum sharply reduced to only the most essential tasks. Milking still had to happen, animals still had to be fed, but the endless list of other labor, the spinning, the fieldwork, the laundry, paused for the day. Church, or meeting, depending on the denomination's preferred term, occupied a significant portion of the day, sometimes running for hours at a stretch in colder New England meeting houses that were, remarkably, entirely unheated, a decision rooted partly in theology, the discomfort considered spiritually appropriate, and partly in simple practicality, since heating a large open structure through an entire New England winter would have consumed an enormous impractical quantity of firewood. Congregants brought small foot warmers, metal boxes filled with hot coals carried from home, tucked under long skirts to provide at least some relief against the cold during a sermon that might run well past an hour, sometimes considerably longer. Children were expected to sit still and silent through the entire service, an expectation enforced, in some meeting houses, by an actual appointed official carrying a long pole, sometimes tipped with a feather on one end, to gently tickle a drowsy adult awake, and a small knob or hard tip on the other end to more firmly correct a fidgeting or whispering child. A job title that genuinely existed and was genuinely called, in some New England communities, the tithing man. Sunday also provided one of the few reliable, socially sanctioned opportunities for courtship, and this deserves real attention, because colonial courtship worked according to rules and customs that would strike most modern people as almost bewilderingly formal, and at the same time, in certain specific ways, more physically intimate than you might expect from an era generally remembered as prudish. Young people met, mingled, and exchanged glances across the meeting house pews or in the churchyard afterward, one of the very few settings where an unmarried young man and woman might interact somewhat freely under the watchful, if often somewhat relaxed, supervision of the wider community. Courtship, once a young man and woman had genuinely caught each other's attention, followed a set of expectations that varied by region and by family, but shared certain broad features across most of the colonies. A young man calling on a young woman would typically visit her family's home in the evening, sitting with her, often under the direct or indirect supervision of her parents, in the main room of the house, conversation the primary activity, though certainly not the only one that mattered. In parts of New England, particularly among more rural or lower church Puritan and Congregationalist communities, a genuinely striking custom called bundling persisted into this period, in which a courting couple, fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board specifically placed between them, were permitted to lie together on a bed for warmth and conversation through a long winter evening. a practice that scandalized outside observers and later generations far more than it apparently scandalized the communities who actually practiced it, who understood it as a practical, chaperoned accommodation to cold houses and long distances rather than any kind of illicit license. I find that detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something true about how differently a culture can define propriety, depending entirely on its own internal logic. Bundling would have seemed shocking to a genteel Philadelphia family and entirely unremarkable to a rural Massachusetts farming household, and both households would have considered themselves, correctly by their own standards, thoroughly respectable. Marriage itself, once a courtship concluded successfully, was overwhelmingly a practical and economic arrangement, as much as, sometimes considerably more than, a romantic one, though genuine affection and even passionate love absolutely existed and shows up repeatedly in surviving letters between colonial spouses that are, frankly, often quite tender. A father's consent mattered enormously, particularly regarding property and inheritance, and a marriage without that consent, while not impossible, carried real social and sometimes legal consequences. The average age at first marriage sat, for women, somewhere in the low 20s across most of the colonies, considerably later than popular imagination often assumes, contrary to the common modern misconception that colonial girls married as young teenagers as a matter of course. That did happen, occasionally, but it was genuinely the exception rather than the rule, and colonial communities themselves generally viewed marriages involving very young brides with some real reservation. Once married, a woman's legal identity, under the English common law inherited wholesale by the colonies, and known by the specific legal term coverture, essentially merged into her husband's. She could not, in most circumstances, own property independently, sign contracts in her own name, or keep wages she might earn from her own labor separate from her husband's control. This legal framework sat in genuinely stark contrast to the enormous practical authority and competence a colonial wife exercised every single day inside her own household, managing budgets, directing servants or children, making countless independent decisions about food, health, and domestic economy that her husband, often occupied elsewhere with farm or trade, simply trusted her to handle without oversight. The law, in other words, described a dependent, nearly invisible legal person, while daily reality described someone running what amounted to a small, complex enterprise. That gap between the woman the law recognized and the woman actually managing the household sits at the very center of everything we have been walking through tonight. Widowhood, when it came, shifted a woman's legal position considerably, and this detail surprises people almost every time I mention it. A widow, unlike a married woman, regained meaningful legal and economic independence, capable of owning property, running a business, signing contracts, and making decisions entirely in her own name. Some of the most successful printers, tavern keepers, and shopkeepers in colonial America were widows who had taken over a deceased husband's business and, freed from the legal constraints of coverture, run it with considerable independent skill for years or even decades afterward. It is a genuinely strange inversion if you think about it, a legal system that granted a woman her fullest independence only after the loss of the very relationship that had, up until that point, defined and constrained nearly everything else about her formal legal existence. Death, in 1776, moved through ordinary households with a frequency and an intimacy that modern life has almost entirely pushed out of sight, and understanding how colonial families actually handled it tells you something important about the emotional texture of their daily existence. There were no funeral homes. When someone died, the body stayed in the house, and the family, usually the women of the household, washed and prepared it themselves, a task performed with a kind of matter-of-fact tenderness that comes only from a culture where death was not hidden away behind institutional walls, but remained, always, a household event. The body was laid out in the main room, sometimes on a cooling board, sometimes simply on the bed, dressed in a winding sheet, or the deceased's best clothing, and neighbors and family came to sit with it, sometimes through an entire night, a practice we would now call a wake, though the term and its exact customs varied by region and denomination. Candles burned continuously during this vigil, not for any specific religious requirement in most Protestant traditions, but simply as a practical and emotional marker that this room, for this stretch of hours, held something that mattered and required attention. A coffin, built quickly, often by the local carpenter, or occasionally by a family member themselves, if the death happened somewhere too remote for a tradesman to reach in time, was simple, unadorned, built from local wood, without the elaborate hardware and lining that would come to define funerals in later, wealthier centuries. Burial happened quickly, usually within a day or two, partly for practical reasons around preserving the body in a world without embalming or refrigeration, and the burial ground itself, whether a church cemetery or a small family plot on the edge of the farm, held generations layered together, the graves of infants who had lived only days sitting alongside grandparents who had lived into genuine old age, a physical record, right there on the landscape, of exactly how uneven and unpredictable a colonial lifespan actually was. Mourning customs, particularly for women, carried real social weight. A widow was expected, by the unwritten but powerfully enforced rules of her community, to wear specific dark, unadorned clothing for a defined period following her husband's death, a visible marker of her grief that the entire community would read and respect, or, if she failed to observe it properly, would notice and quietly judge. Children who lost a parent, which happened with genuine frequency given the mortality rates we discussed earlier, were often absorbed into the households of relatives, remarried step-parents, or occasionally, in cases of genuine poverty and no surviving family able to take them in, bound out as servants or apprentices at an age that would strike modern sensibilities as shockingly young, sometimes 7 or 8 years old, sent to live and labor in another household entirely. And yet, for all this proximity to loss, colonial households were not, I think, cultures of despair. They developed out of sheer necessity an entire emotional vocabulary and religious framework for holding grief without being permanently undone by it, leaning heavily on faith, on the specific comfort of believing a lost child or spouse had gone to a better and more permanent home, on the practical demands of a farm and a family that simply could not stop functioning no matter how deep the private sorrow underneath. There is something worth admiring in that, even now. Not because their grief was smaller than ours, because their capacity to keep living inside it and around it, and sometimes genuinely past it, asked something of them that most of us, mercifully, will never have to summon in quite the same way. Let's turn now toward leisure, because even inside a world this demanding, colonial people absolutely found time for pleasure, and the shapes that pleasure took are, I think, some of the most quietly charming details in this entire story. The tavern, in nearly every colonial town, functioned as something considerably more central to community life than the word tavern suggests to modern ears. It was not simply a place to drink, though drinking certainly happened there, and colonial Americans, by most surviving records, drank a genuinely remarkable quantity of alcohol by modern standards, cider, beer, and rum appearing at meals with a regularity that would raise eyebrows today, partly because water quality in some towns was genuinely uncertain, and partly because it was simply deeply woven into the ordinary rhythm of daily refreshment, rather than treated as a special occasion indulgence. The tavern also served as the community's post office, its newsroom, its meeting hall, and its social club, all at once. A traveller passing through carried news from other towns, other colonies, sometimes from across the ocean, and that news got discussed, debated, and argued over across tavern tables with a passion that, in the specific political climate of 1776, increasingly touched on the question of independence itself. Committees of correspondence and local militia often organized their actual meetings inside a tavern's main room, meaning this space, unassuming as it looked from the street, functioned as a genuine engine room of revolutionary organizing in towns across the colonies. Games filled tavern evenings too, cards, dice, and a variety of table games with names that have mostly faded from modern memory, alongside more physical amusements outdoors when weather allowed, including a rough colonial ancestor of bowling played on a flattened stretch of grass, and various forms of foot races and wrestling matches that men organized informally, sometimes with modest wages attached. Women's leisure, by contrast, happened almost entirely within domestic or church-adjacent settings, since taverns were considered by the social conventions of the era spaces overwhelmingly reserved for men, though women travelling with their husbands or running an inn themselves, which some widows genuinely did, were certainly present there as well, just rarely as casual patrons. Quilting, for women, occupied a fascinating dual role as both genuinely necessary domestic production and one of the era's most cherished social gatherings. A quilting bee brought neighbouring women together around a single large frame, working collectively on a quilt that a single woman working alone might have taken weeks to complete by herself, the gathering stretching across an entire afternoon, filled with conversation, news, and the kind of easy companionship that the isolated, labour-heavy nature of most colonial women's daily lives otherwise offered relatively little room for. These gatherings mattered enormously for reasons beyond the finished quilt itself. They were, for many colonial women, among the only regular occasions where they left their own household's four walls and spent sustained hours in the company of other women, sharing burdens, advice, and simple human connection in a world that otherwise kept them working largely alone. Reading, where literacy allowed it, provided a quieter, more solitary pleasure, though the material available differed enormously from what a modern reader might expect. The Bible sat at the centre of most colonial households' reading life, alongside almanacs, which were genuinely among the most widely owned and read publications in the entire colonies. Combining practical information, weather predictions, planting guides, and astronomical data with proverbs, jokes, and short pieces of moral or entertaining writing, functioning as something close to a yearly household reference book and entertainment digest rolled into one. Poor Richard's Almanac, published for years by Benjamin Franklin under his pen name, was by 1776 already a genuine cultural institution, its aphorisms about thrift, hard work, and practical wisdom quoted and repeated in households that had never read a single other book cover to cover in their entire lives. Let's talk about winter for a moment, because the season shaped colonial daily life so thoroughly that describing an ordinary day without accounting for which season it fell in would leave out something essential. Summer, the season this particular year of 1776 is most often remembered for, thanks to the Declaration's July date, brought its own considerable hardships: heat that made heavy wool clothing genuinely miserable, insects that modern pest control has made almost impossible to fully imagine, mosquitoes and flies in numbers that surviving diaries describe with real weary exasperation, and the constant, urgent labour of the growing season pressing down on every available hour of daylight. Winter, though, tested a colonial household in an entirely different register, one built around scarcity, cold, and a dramatic contraction of the working day itself, since daylight in December and January might offer only 9 hours between sunrise and sunset, compressing every outdoor task into a genuinely narrow window. The cold itself was not an abstraction to be adjusted away with a thermostat. Houses, even well-built ones, were drafty by any modern standard, gaps around windows and doors letting in a steady thin current of outside air that no amount of careful fire tending could ever fully overcome. Families in colder regions often slept with a warming pan, a long-handled metal container filled with hot coals, run briefly between the sheets just before bed, to take the worst of the chill off before anyone actually climbed in, a small nightly ritual that made the difference between a bed you dreaded and a bed you could actually bear to enter. Multiple people shared beds as an absolute matter of course through the winter months, not simply out of necessity for space, though that mattered too, but genuinely for warmth, body heat pooling under heavy layers of quilts and blankets in a way that a single sleeper, however well covered, simply could not replicate alone. Children often slept 2, 3, sometimes more to a bed, and this shared sleeping arrangement, so different from the modern expectation of separate rooms and separate beds for every family member, shaped a kind of physical closeness and constant low-level awareness of each other's presence that colonial childhood simply took for granted as the ordinary texture of a night's rest. Indoor winter work filled the shortened days that outdoor labor could no longer occupy. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and mending consumed enormous stretches of a woman's winter hours. The household's entire clothing supply for the coming year, often produced, patched, or repaired, During these months when fieldwork paused, men turned toward indoor tasks of their own, repairing tools and harnesses, carving wooden implements, splitting and stacking the truly staggering quantity of firewood a colonial household consumed across an entire winter, sometimes estimated at 20 or 30 cords for a single family, a volume of cut, split, and stacked wood that is genuinely difficult to picture until you have actually stood beside a woodpile of that size. Snow and ice brought their own specific dangers that a modern reader, accustomed to ploughed roads and heated cars, can easily underestimate. A journey that took an hour in good weather might become genuinely dangerous, even fatal, in a sudden winter storm, and colonial newspapers and diaries from this period record, with a regularity that feels almost shocking today, deaths from exposure among travelers caught unexpectedly by falling temperatures or a storm that arrived faster than they had judged. Livestock, too, required real vigilance through the winter months, a barn poorly sealed against wind, or a water trough allowed to freeze solid without anyone noticing in time, could mean the loss of an animal a family's entire economic survival depended on. Diversity, in 1776, looked genuinely different across the 13 colonies than most modern summaries suggest, and I think it is worth spending real time on this, because the phrase colonial America often gets flattened in popular memory into a single imagined culture when the actual lived reality on the ground was considerably more varied. Pennsylvania alone held substantial German-speaking communities, often called Pennsylvania Dutch, a corruption of Deutsch, whose farmhouses, foodways, and even daily speech differed markedly from their English-speaking neighbors just a few miles away. Dutch communities persisted in parts of New York, a lingering legacy of the colony's earlier existence as New Netherland, with their own distinct church traditions, architectural habits, and household customs still visibly shaping daily life more than a century after English control had formally replaced Dutch governance. Scots-Irish immigrants, arriving in large numbers across the 18th century, pushed heavily into the backcountry regions of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, bringing with them their own distinct Presbyterian religious traditions, their own patterns of farmstead layout, and, in many cases, a fierce independence from the more established, wealthier coastal elites who dominated colonial government, a tension that would shape political alignments through the Revolutionary period in ways that had genuinely little to do with the more famous ideological debates happening in Philadelphia. Huguenot families, French Protestants who had fled religious persecution in earlier generations, had settled in pockets from South Carolina to New York. Their descendants by 1776 often thoroughly assimilated into English-speaking colonial life while still carrying faint threads of distinct culinary and religious tradition passed down through their families. Jewish communities, small but genuinely established, existed in port cities including Newport, Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York, maintaining synagogues, kosher dietary practices, and distinct religious calendars inside a broader colonial culture that was overwhelmingly, thoroughly Protestant Christian in its public institutions and assumptions. A Jewish household in Newport, keeping the Sabbath from Friday evening through Saturday, existed inside the same colonial world as the Puritan households of nearby Massachusetts, observing their own Sunday Sabbath, two entirely distinct rhythms of weekly religious observance, operating within a relatively short distance of each other. And then there is the frontier itself, the western edge of colonial settlement, a genuinely different world from the more established coastal communities we have spent most of tonight describing. Families settling in the backcountry of Pennsylvania, Virginia, or the Carolinas often lived considerably more isolated lives, sometimes miles from any neighbor, in log cabins built quickly from whatever timber the surrounding forest supplied, without the more established infrastructure, mills, churches, formal roads that shaped daily life closer to the coast. Relations with Native American nations along this frontier, including the Cherokee, Shawnee, Iroquois Confederacy, and many others whose territories bordered or overlapped with colonial expansion, ranged across the full spectrum from trade and coexistence to genuine violence and displacement, a long, complicated, and often deeply painful history that predates 1776 by well over a century and would continue in various brutal forms for generations afterward. It is worth being honest in a story like this one that colonial expansion westward was not a peaceful, empty land waiting to be settled. the framing so many older histories relied on. It was land that native nations had lived on, farmed, hunted and governed for many centuries, and every acre a colonial family cleared for a new farm represented, somewhere in its history, a displacement, a broken treaty, or an act of violence that the tidy domestic details of daily colonial life, the spinning wheels and the hearth fires and the quilting bees, sat directly downstream of. Whether the families living those daily details thought about that connection or not, many did not. Some, particularly among certain Quaker communities in Pennsylvania who maintained genuinely more respectful and negotiated relationships with neighboring native nations for a period of decades, thought about it considerably more than most. The full truth of this history deserves far more than the few honest sentences I can give it tonight, and I would gently encourage you, if this particular thread interests you, to seek out native voices and native historians telling this part of the story in their own words and with the depth it genuinely requires. When a militia muster call actually arrived at a household's door, the disruption it caused rippled through daily life in ways that lasted considerably longer than the muster itself. A man leaving for even a short local militia service, let alone the longer stretches of duty that the escalating war would soon demand, left behind a farm that did not pause its needs simply because its primary labourer had gone. Wives, as we touched on earlier, absorbed this labour gap directly, and letters surviving from this period, written by women to husbands away with the militia, or as the war deepened, with the Continental Army itself, a genuinely striking reading, full of practical farm updates delivered in the same breath as expressions of worry and longing. A wife reporting that the wheat looked promising this year in one sentence, and asking in the next whether her husband had enough warm clothing and whether he was eating properly. These letters travelled slowly and unreliably, carried by whatever traveller happened to be heading in roughly the right direction, sometimes taking weeks to arrive, sometimes never arriving at all, lost along a journey that had no tracking number, no guarantee, nothing beyond the goodwill of a passing rider willing to carry a folded, sealed letter one stage further toward its destination. A woman waiting for word from a husband or son with the army lived inside a genuine, sustained uncertainty that is difficult for a modern person, accustomed to instant communication, to fully inhabit. Weeks, sometimes months, could pass with no information at all, and the arrival of any letter, regardless of its actual content, carried an emotional weight that went considerably beyond whatever news it happened to contain, simply because it confirmed, at minimum, that the person writing it had still been alive on the day the ink went down. Some women did not stay behind at all. Camp followers, as they were called at the time, a term that has picked up unfair connotations over the centuries but originally described something considerably more practical and honourable, travelled with the Continental Army in genuinely significant numbers, cooking, washing laundry, nursing the sick and wounded, and in some documented cases, taking up arms directly during actual combat when circumstances demanded it. Martha Washington herself spent considerable time at winter encampments alongside her husband, and she was far from the only officer's wife to do so, though the experience of an ordinary soldier's wife following the army looked considerably harder and more precarious than anything available to a general's household. These women faced disease, hunger, and danger alongside the soldiers themselves, performing labour the army's official structure depended on entirely while receiving little formal recognition and, often, barely subsistence-level provisions in return. In the cities themselves, particularly Boston, which had already endured a lengthy British military occupation before the war's opening battles, and would remain a deeply contested, anxious place through much of 1776, daily life took on a texture of genuine tension that rural farm families further inland were spared. Families in occupied or contested port cities lived with soldiers quartered in or near their homes, with shortages considerably more severe than the countryside experienced, and with a constant, low-grade uncertainty about which direction the political and military wind might shift next, a genuinely different daily experience of this same historical year from the one a Virginia tobacco farm or a Pennsylvania backcountry homestead was living through at the very same moment. New York City, which would fall to British forces later that same year in the autumn of 1776, spent the summer we are focused on tonight in a state of visible, mounting military preparation, fortifications being built, troops moving through streets that had, only a few years earlier, carried nothing more dramatic than the ordinary bustle of a busy colonial port. Families living in these contested cities made real difficult decisions that summer about whether to stay and risk whatever occupation or battle might come, or to flee inland with whatever possessions a cart could carry, leaving behind homes, shops, and the accumulated material life of years, uncertain whether they would ever return to find any of it still standing. Disease, beyond the general medical landscape we already touched on, took one particular, genuinely dramatic shape across the colonies in exactly this year, and it is a detail most classroom accounts of 1776 leave out entirely, even though it shaped the daily reality of thousands of families as directly as any battle did. Smallpox moved through the colonies and through the Continental Army with a ferocity that, by some estimates from historians studying this period, may have killed more colonial and continental soldiers across the broader revolutionary period than combat itself ever did, and the disease reached into civilian households with equal, indiscriminate force. A smallpox outbreak did not arrive quietly. It announced itself first with fever and body aches that could, in the early days, resemble almost any ordinary illness, before the characteristic rash appeared, spreading across the face and body, developing into the raised, fluid-filled pustules that gave the disease both its name and its terror. Survivors, and there were many, carried visible pitted scarring for the rest of their lives, a permanent physical record legible on faces across every colony, common enough that an unmarked, unscarred adult face was, in certain communities during outbreak years, almost as notable as a scarred one. Death rates for those who contracted the disease without any prior immunity ran genuinely high, and entire households could be devastated within a matter of weeks once the illness took hold inside a single home. Inoculation, a genuinely controversial practice by 1776, offered one real defense, though it looked nothing like the vaccination you would recognize today. A physician, or sometimes simply an experienced practitioner without formal medical training, would deliberately introduce a small amount of matter from an active smallpox pustule into a shallow cut on a healthy person's arm, producing in most cases a milder, controlled version of the disease that conferred lasting immunity once the patient recovered. The procedure carried real risk of its own. A small but genuine percentage of inoculated patients still died from the deliberately induced illness, and inoculated individuals remained contagious to others throughout their recovery, meaning the practice required careful isolation, often at a dedicated inoculation hospital set up specifically for the purpose, kept well away from the general population for the several weeks recovery typically required. This risk, combined with religious objections from some quarters, who viewed deliberately courting illness as a dangerous interference with divine providence, made inoculation a genuinely divisive practice, banned outright at various points in several colonies, embraced enthusiastically in others. General Washington himself, watching smallpox tear through his own army with a speed that threatened to cripple the entire Continental war effort from the inside, made the consequential decision in early 1777, just months after the year we are focused on tonight, to order mandatory inoculation across the Continental Army, a decision now recognized by military historians as one of the more quietly consequential choices of the entire war, arguably saving the army from a biological catastrophe considerably more devastating than anything the British forces themselves managed to inflict directly. For an ordinary family that summer, the fear of smallpox sat as a genuinely constant, low background hum beneath everything else happening around them, a fear sharpened rather than eased by the movement of soldiers and militia through their communities, since a travelling army, gathering men from across many different towns and colonies into close, crowded quarters, created exactly the conditions the disease spread through most efficiently. A mother watching her husband or son march off to join the militia that year carried, alongside her fear of musket fire and British bayonets, a very real, very immediate fear of a disease that could travel home with him in his own body and sweep through her entire household before anyone even understood what was happening. Money itself, in 1776, worked in a way that would confuse most modern people within about 30 seconds of trying to actually use it, and understanding this small confusing detail explains a great deal about how ordinary transactions actually happened between neighbors across the colonies. There was no single unified American currency, not yet, not for years to come. Each colony issued its own paper currency, valued differently against the others, and against British pound sterling, and against an entire second, informally circulating economy of Spanish silver dollars, which had become, thanks to extensive Spanish trade throughout the Americas, genuinely common in colonial pockets and cash boxes, despite having nothing officially to do with any British colonial government at all. On top of this already tangled situation, the Continental Congress had begun issuing its own paper currency to help fund the war effort, and this continental currency would go on, across the following several years, to suffer such severe devaluation that the phrase "not worth a continental" entered the American language as a lasting idiom for something genuinely worthless. Though in the summer of 1776 specifically, that dramatic collapse still lay mostly ahead rather than already having happened. Given this genuinely chaotic monetary landscape, ordinary colonial households relied enormously on barter and informal credit to actually conduct daily business with each other, a system that functioned considerably more like a web of running accounts and mutual obligation than anything resembling a modern cash transaction. A farmer might bring eggs and butter to the local shopkeeper, receiving in exchange not coins but a credit entered into the shopkeeper's account book, a credit he could then draw against later for nails, cloth, or tools. The actual settling of accounts between the two men, sometimes happening only once or twice a year, if that often, built entirely on a foundation of accumulated trust between people who had known each other and each other's families for years or even generations. This meant that a colonial household's genuine wealth was measured considerably less by cash on hand, which many families held remarkably little of at any given moment, and considerably more by land, livestock, tools, and the accumulated web of credit and obligation a family had built with its neighbors over time. An entirely different way of understanding prosperity than the bank balance-focused framework most modern people carry around in their heads. A family could be, in this sense, genuinely prosperous while holding almost no actual coin at all, their wealth expressed instead through a well-stocked barn, a respected name in the local account books, and land that had in many cases been worked by the same family for 2 or 3 generations already. As afternoon eases into the later part of the day, and before we follow this household all the way into evening, I want to spend a moment on candles, because light itself, something you and I switch on without a single conscious thought, represented a genuine, ongoing labor investment for a colonial family that is worth understanding properly. Candles were made at home, usually once or twice a year, in a dedicated session that filled the house with a heavy, faintly unpleasant smell that lingered for days afterward. Tallow rendered from animal fat, the least expensive and most common option, producing a candle that smoked more and smelled distinctly of the animal it came from, or beeswax, considerably more pleasant, considerably more expensive, generally reserved for special occasions or for households with genuine money to spare on the comfort of a cleaner burning light. Dipping was the more common household method. A length of wick, usually twisted cotton or linen, repeatedly lowered into a kettle of melted tallow and lifted out again, cooling briefly between each dip, the candle slowly, gradually thickening with each pass through the hot fat, a process requiring dozens of individual dips to build a candle of usable size, and requiring, across an afternoon of this work, the production of enough candles to genuinely last the household through several months, since the whole point of the exercise was to avoid repeating this smoky, tedious labor any more often than absolutely necessary. Wealthier households, or those with access to purchased candle molds, could produce more uniform candles more quickly, pouring melted tallow or wax directly into reusable metal or pewter molds shaped like the finished candle, a genuine convenience by the standards of the day. And even once made, a candle was not treated casually. Households counted them, rationed them, and burnt them with real awareness of their cost, because a colonial evening spent by candlelight was, in a very direct sense, spending stored labor, hours of rendering fat and dipping wick, every single time a candle got lit. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something genuinely important about why colonial households organized their entire day around available daylight rather than around any fixed clock time, an arrangement summarized in the old saying, still occasionally heard even now though its origin has mostly been forgotten: early to bed and early to rise. That saying was not really about virtue or discipline in the way it gets quoted today. It was, quite literally, an economic strategy. Daylight was free. Candlelight cost real, tangible labor. A sensible household simply used as much of the free resource as possible before paying for the expensive one. By the time full evening genuinely arrives then, and the fire has been banked lower, and perhaps a single candle or two burns on the table, the household gathers into whatever quiet remains of the day. This is often when stories get told, not written stories, spoken ones, passed between generations with no fixed text at all, changing slightly with every retelling depending on who was doing the telling and what mood the room happened to be in that particular night. An older relative might recount a family history stretching back to whichever ancestor first crossed the ocean, the hardships of that crossing embellished a little more with each passing decade, or a folk tale about a local landmark, a strange rock formation, or an old abandoned foundation somewhere in the woods, said to be haunted or cursed by some half-remembered event that had happened there a generation or two earlier. Ghost stories, genuinely, were common entertainment on a colonial evening, told partly for the real pleasure of a good scare in a house lit only by firelight and a single candle, where every shadow in the corner of the room could, for a moment, plausibly be something else entirely. Music filled these evenings too, more often than you might expect from a culture sometimes remembered, unfairly, as uniformly stern and joyless. Fiddles were genuinely common across colonial households of nearly every region and background, relatively affordable, portable, and capable of carrying both the solemn hymn tunes some households favored and the livelier dance melodies that filled barn raisings, weddings, and other community gatherings throughout the year. Singing, unaccompanied by any instrument at all, remained the single most universal form of colonial music making, hymns above all, but also ballads, work songs, and the specific call and response singing traditions that enslaved communities had developed and maintained. Drawing on West African musical structures carried across the ocean, traditions that would go on, over the following century, to shape the entire future direction of American music in ways that the era itself had no way of anticipating. Dancing, when the occasion allowed it, brought real, unguarded joy into colonial evenings. Contra dances and reels performed at weddings, at harvest celebrations, and at the specific, genuinely festive gatherings that surrounded militia training days, which functioned, somewhat surprisingly, as much as community social occasions as actual military preparation. A militia muster day drew families from across a wide surrounding area into the town centre, the men going through their drilling and training in the morning, the afternoon and evening frequently dissolving into something considerably closer to a fair, food shared communally, contests of strength and skill, and, as the light faded, music and dancing that stretched the day's genuine seriousness into something that also, unmistakably, felt like a celebration. Weddings themselves, once the courtship customs we discussed earlier had run their course toward an actual marriage, brought entire communities together in a way few other occasions could match. The ceremony itself, depending on denomination, might be relatively brief and simple, but the celebration surrounding it often stretched across an entire day, or even longer, neighbors contributing food, drink, and labor, the newly married couple sometimes receiving practical gifts of household goods, tools, or livestock meant to help establish their new household, since a colonial wedding was understood, quite explicitly, as the founding of an entirely new economic unit within the community, not simply a private romantic milestone between two people. Harvest, when it arrived successfully, brought its own specific gratitude and celebration, a good harvest meaning the difference between a comfortable winter and a genuinely difficult one, and communities across the colonies marked this moment with gatherings that blended practical cooperative labor, an entire neighborhood turning out to help bring in a particularly large crop before weather could threaten it, with the shared meal and social pleasure that followed once the physical work was finally done. Thanksgiving, as a specific fixed annual holiday in the form you might recognize today, did not yet exist in 1776 in any standardized national sense that would come considerably later, but the underlying impulse, a community gathering to share food and express gratitude after a successful harvest, was already a genuinely old and familiar tradition across New England in particular, observed with real sincerity even without the specific fixed calendar date and national mythology that would eventually attach themselves to it. Hunting and fishing offered men a form of leisure that also, quite practically, supplemented the household's food supply, and the line between recreation and genuine economic contribution blurred considerably in this activity in a way that most modern leisure simply does not. A man heading out with a musket on a quiet afternoon was, at once, enjoying a genuine pleasure, the company of a hunting dog if the family kept one, the particular satisfaction of moving quietly through familiar woods and also contributing real, tangible value to his household's table, venison or wild turkey, or a string of fish representing meat the family would not need to slaughter one of their own precious, carefully raised domestic animals to obtain. Let's shift the scene now, gently, away from the single farmhouse we have mostly been sitting inside tonight, and into a colonial port city, because urban daily life in 1776 followed a genuinely different rhythm from the rural world we have spent most of this evening exploring, and I think it is worth walking through, if only briefly, before we settle back down towards sleep. Philadelphia, by this year already the largest city in all 13 colonies, home to something in the range of 30,000 people, offered a daily texture that a farm family several days' travel inland would have found almost bewildering in its density and its noise. A merchant's wife in Philadelphia, married to a man who traded in imported goods, sugar, cloth, tea when it could still be had, spices carried across an entire ocean, ran a household that looked considerably more like the wealthier households you might already be picturing from other videos on this channel. Servants present, sometimes several, furniture and dishware imported rather than homemade, a genuine measure of comfort that most rural colonial families simply had no access to. And yet even this comparatively comfortable urban household still lacked, in 1776, the running water, the reliable heat, and the basic conveniences that would make its daily rhythm recognizable to a modern visitor. She still relied on servants or her own labor to fetch water, still cooked over an open hearth, still dressed in the same fundamental layers of shift, stays and gown that a farmwife 3 counties away was wearing that same morning, simply rendered in finer, more expensive fabric. One rung down this urban economic ladder, a shopkeeper's family lived directly above or behind the shop itself in the common colonial pattern, the wife often working the counter herself for stretches of the day, managing customers, credit accounts, and inventory alongside her domestic responsibilities, a genuine blending of commercial and household labor that blurred lines a modern reader might expect to find kept carefully separate. Her children grew up literally inside the family business, absorbing its rhythms and its arithmetic from an early age in a way that shaped their entire understanding of how a household actually sustained itself. And then, considerably further down this urban economic ladder, existed a genuinely large population of poor and working families, laborers, sailors' wives managing households alone for months at a stretch, while husbands were at sea, widows scraping by on needlework and taken in laundry, families who occupied cramped rented rooms rather than owning any property at all. Poverty in a colonial city carried its own specific texture, considerably different from rural hardship, since a poor urban family lacked even the partial food security a farm, however struggling, at least offered through its own garden and livestock. An urban poor family depended entirely on wages, credit, and, when genuine crisis hit, on the uneven, often quite limited charity structures that colonial towns maintained, usually organized through the church or a small local poor relief system, considerably less reliable and considerably more precarious than anything a modern reader would recognize as a social safety net. Sailors' wives, specifically, occupied a genuinely distinct category of colonial womanhood worth pausing on, because their husband's absence was not occasional, the way a militia muster might pull a farmer away for weeks at a time, but genuinely routine, voyages lasting months, sometimes well over a year, meaning these women managed entire households and, frequently, small businesses of their own, essentially as single heads of household for the majority of their married lives, developing an independence and competence that the formal legal structure of coverture never quite acknowledged existed. even as it visibly, undeniably did. I want to return for a moment to the household of an enslaved woman, because I mentioned her briefly earlier, and I do not want that mention to be the only space she occupies in a story that claims to be about ordinary people's daily lives, when her daily life, and the daily lives of hundreds of thousands like her across the colonies in 1776, was every bit as woven through with routine, with skill, with small private moments of care and resistance as everything else we have spent tonight describing, even as it existed under conditions of theft and violence that nothing else tonight has had to reckon with in the same way. Maybe she is 32 years old, working in the kitchen of a Virginia plantation house, a role that carried, within the deeply unjust hierarchy enslavers imposed, a small measure of relative status compared to field work, proximity to the main house, sometimes better access to leftover food, but also brought its own particular burdens: constant, close proximity to the family that owned her, little privacy, and the specific exhausting demand of cooking two entirely different sets of meals each day, elaborate dishes for the household that enslaved her, and simpler, harder rations for her own family in whatever cabin they were permitted, foods drawing on both the European cooking traditions she had been forced to learn and the West African foodways her own mother or grandmother had carried across the ocean and quietly, persistently preserved, rice dishes, okra, black-eyed peas, techniques and ingredients that would, over the following centuries, fundamentally shape what the entire world now recognizes as Southern American cooking, a debt the wider culture has been slow, painfully slow, to properly acknowledge. Her own children, if she had been permitted to keep them near her, which was never guaranteed and depended entirely on the will of the people who claimed ownership over her family, grew up understanding from an almost impossibly young age the specific, constant vigilance their world demanded, learning early which words could be spoken and which had to stay silent, which glances were safe and which were not, a form of enforced adult awareness layered onto childhood that no child should have had to carry, and that hundreds of thousands of enslaved children across the colonies carried anyway, because their circumstances gave them no alternative. And still, inside these brutally constrained circumstances, enslaved communities built genuine, resilient culture, quietly, insistently, in whatever narrow margins they were permitted. Music that carried coded meaning, invisible to those who enslaved them. Herbal medicine knowledge, drawn from both African tradition and knowledge exchanged, sometimes with native communities, that treated illness and injury when no formal doctor was ever made available to them. Family bonds maintained and fiercely protected even when the law offered them no recognition whatsoever, godparents and chosen kin stepping in when blood relatives were sold away, a practice of extended, resilient family structure that enslaved communities relied on precisely because the legal and economic system around them was actively, constantly working to tear biological families apart. Indentured servitude, which we touched on briefly earlier, deserves a slightly fuller look as well, because it occupied its own distinct, legally different position from chattel slavery, while still representing a genuinely hard and constrained existence for the people living inside it. An indentured servant, having traded a fixed term of years for the cost of an Atlantic crossing, worked under the direction of whoever held their contract, often with limited personal freedom, subject to physical punishment in many colonies, and without wages during the term of service itself, though with the essential legal difference that this bondage was, at least in principle, temporary, and often included, at the end of the term, a promise of what got called freedom dues, a small payment or grant of land, tools, or clothing meant to help a newly freed servant establish an independent life. In practice, this promise was honored with genuinely wide inconsistency, and many former indentured servants emerged from their term with considerably less than they had been promised, into a colonial economy that offered a formerly bound laborer with little capital and few connections a genuinely difficult path toward the independent prosperity the system's own mythology had promised them. Let's come back now to that first house we started tonight's story inside, the one with the coals still glowing low under grey ash, because I want to walk you all the way through to the end of this particular day with her, the woman we met before dawn this morning, kneeling at the hearth with the tinderbox in her hands. Let's call her Mercy, a name genuinely common enough in New England households of this period, that it would not have raised a single eyebrow, one of those old virtue names, patience, prudence, charity, mercy, that Puritan families favoured for daughters for well over a century, a small daily reminder, spoken aloud every single time someone called her name across the yard, of exactly which qualities her community expected her to embody. By the time full dusk settles over her farm, Mercy has been awake for something close to 17 hours, and the specific texture of her tiredness by this point in the evening is worth naming honestly, because it was not the tiredness of a single long task, but the accumulated weight of dozens of separate small tasks, each one manageable alone, all of them together forming a kind of exhaustion that had genuinely nowhere to be set down until the household finally fully stopped for the night. The last of the evening milking is done, the chickens are shut in, whatever mending needed doing by candlelight, a torn hem, a stocking with a hole worn through at the heel, gets picked up now in these final quiet hours, her needle moving by a single flickering flame while the rest of the household settles. Her husband, if he is home this particular night and not away with the militia, might be doing his own version of this quiet evening labour nearby, oiling a harness, sharpening a blade, the two of them working in a companionable silence that required no conversation to feel complete, the kind of shared quiet that develops between two people who have spent years managing an entire household and its endless demands together, who no longer need to narrate every small thing to each other because so much of it has simply become understood. The children, by now, are being coaxed toward whatever sleeping arrangement the house holds, the youngest already drowsy against Mercy's shoulder, the older ones climbing the ladder toward the loft with the particular reluctant slowness of children who are tired but not yet ready to admit it, a last cup of milk perhaps before bed, a prayer, said aloud, sometimes led by Mercy herself, sometimes by her husband if he is present, thanking whatever providence had carried the household safely through another day, a genuine, unironic gratitude that shows up again and again in the surviving diaries and letters of this period, offered by people whose days had contained more physical hardship than most modern readers will ever personally know, and who still, each night, found something specific and real to be thankful for. Sleep itself in 1776 is worth understanding a little more closely, because the shape of a colonial night differs from a modern one in ways that recent historians have found genuinely fascinating. Considerable evidence, drawn from diaries, court records, and medical texts of the period, suggests that many people across this era, not universally, but commonly enough to be a recognized and unremarkable pattern, slept in two distinct segments through the night, what some historians now call first sleep and second sleep, with a waking period of an hour or more in between, somewhere in the deep quiet of the night, used for quiet reflection, prayer, low conversation with a spouse also lying awake, or simply resting in the dark without any particular urgency to fall back asleep immediately. This makes a certain kind of sense once you actually sit with it. Without artificial light structuring the evening into the single continuous block modern life expects sleep to occupy, and with a solid 9 or 10 hours of actual darkness available through much of the year, especially in winter, a colonial household's sleep naturally spread itself across a longer window, unhurried, broken by this quiet middle waking that carried none of the anxiety a modern person might feel, checking a clock at 3 in the morning, because there was no clock to check, no morning alarm demanding a specific return to sleep. The night simply was what it was, long and dark, and within it, room enough for waking gently and drifting back down again without any pressure attached to either state. Mercy, lying in the dark beside her sleeping children this particular night in the summer of 1776, likely spends some portion of her own quiet waking hour thinking about the letter that has not yet come, whichever son or husband or brother is somewhere with the militia this season, the specific ache of not knowing, tonight, whether he is safe, warm, fed, whether the news that eventually reaches her farm will be good or terrible, an uncertainty that sat, that particular summer, underneath the surface of even the most ordinary domestic tasks, present in a way that never fully announced itself, but never fully left either. And this is, I think, one of the truest things I can offer you about this specific year, 1776, the one everyone remembers for its single famous document and its fireworks and its declarations. For the overwhelming majority of the people actually living through it, the ones spinning thread and churning butter and nursing infants and burying the occasional grandparent, it did not feel from the inside like a hinge point in world history. It felt like an ordinary, difficult, occasionally joyful year, made harder than most by shortage and uncertainty and the specific dread of a war whose outcome nobody living through it could possibly have known in advance, stitched through with the same small daily rituals, the same fires lit before dawn, the same bread baked and mended stockings and evening prayers that had structured colonial life for generations before it, and would continue to structure it for years after the specific political outcome of that year was finally settled. That is the thing history books rarely manage to convey properly, because history books are, by their nature, written backward, from an ending we already know, toward a beginning that felt, to the people actually living it, genuinely uncertain in every direction. Mercy did not know, lying awake in her quiet hour that night, whether the cause her husband had marched off to serve would succeed or fail, whether the shortages would ease or worsen, whether the child sleeping beside her would grow up in an independent nation or a defeated colony reabsorbed, punished, back into an empire it had briefly, audaciously tried to leave. She simply did what the moment in front of her demanded, the way people in every era of history have always simply done what the moment in front of them demanded. One ordinary day folded into the next, until, eventually, enough of those ordinary days had accumulated into something large enough to be called history at all. Let's step back briefly to the beginning of a life, rather than its end, because we spent real time earlier on the risks of colonial childbirth, and I think the arrival of a healthy child deserves its own moment tonight too, since it happened, despite everything working against it, with genuine regularity across every household we have discussed. Once a baby was safely delivered, usually inside the same room the family used for nearly everything else, attended by the midwife and, very often, by several other women of the household or neighborhood who had come to assist and to keep the mother company through labor, a practice that meant childbirth, whatever its dangers, was rarely a lonely experience, surrounded instead by a genuinely dense, supportive network of female community. Baptism followed quickly in most Christian colonial households, often within days rather than weeks, reflecting genuine, urgent theological concern in an era of high infant mortality about an unbaptized infant's spiritual standing should the worst happen before the ceremony could take place. Naming a child carried its own set of customs and expectations, family names repeating across generations with real deliberateness. A first son very often named directly after his father or grandfather, a daughter after her mother or a beloved aunt, the specific choice of name functioning as a small, deliberate act of honoring and continuity within a family line, though we already touched on how New England households in particular also favored those virtue names, mercy, patience, prudence, hope, names that doubled as a kind of daily spoken aspiration for the child who carried them. Godparents, in denominations that observed the tradition, took on genuine responsibility, not the largely ceremonial role the term often implies today, but a real, socially understood obligation to help raise the child in the faith and, in the event of a parent's death, sometimes to take on considerably more direct responsibility for the child's upbringing, a safety net woven directly into the fabric of colonial family structure, precisely because parental death was common enough that every family needed some backup plan for its children already quietly in place. Now let me carry you somewhere slightly different for a stretch, away from Mercy's farm, because I don't want tonight's story to leave you with the impression that a single household's rhythm speaks for the whole of colonial America, and there is a version of this same summer worth glimpsing from a genuinely different vantage point. Picture, instead, a small fishing village on the Massachusetts coast, somewhere north of Boston, where the entire rhythm of daily life bends around the sea rather than the field. Maybe here she is a fisherman's wife, her husband gone for stretches of days or weeks at a time out on the fishing banks, and her daily labor, while it shares plenty in common with Mercy's, farm animals if the family kept any, a garden, the same spinning and cooking and mending, carries its own additional weight entirely specific to a coastal life. Salting and drying the catch when the boats come informs an enormous, urgent labor push concentrated into short, intense windows of time, an entire village's women working together along the shore, gutting and splitting fish, laying them out on drying racks under a sun that has to do its work quickly before spoilage sets in. The smell of the process settling over the entire village in a way that anyone who grew up in such a place would tell you never fully left their memory. Decades later, even after they had moved far away from any coastline at all, she watches the water more than Mercy watches her fields, in a sense, scanning the horizon on evenings when the boats are expected back. A specific coastal anxiety layered on top of the same wartime uncertainty every colonial family carried that particular summer, since British naval activity along the coast that year had made even ordinary fishing voyages considerably more dangerous than they had been in peaceful years. British warships and privateers occasionally seizing colonial vessels outright, meaning a fisherman's wife watching for her husband's boat that summer watched with a specific, sharpened dread that a farmer's wife inland, worried about militia service, experienced in a related but distinctly different form. Let's talk for a moment about letters themselves, since we have mentioned them several times tonight without ever really looking closely at what writing one actually involved, because the physical act of correspondence in 1776 required a genuinely different kind of patience and skill than anything a modern person accustomed to typing and instantly sending a message would recognize. Paper first was a genuine expense, imported or produced domestically in small quantities from rag mills that processed old linen and cotton cloth into pulp. Expensive enough that a colonial letter writer used every available inch of a page, sometimes turning the paper sideways once filled, and writing a second layer of text directly across the first at a right angle, a practice called cross-hatching that produced pages genuinely difficult to read, even for people fluent in the handwriting of the era, but that saved considerable money on an expensive resource. Ink was frequently made at home, as we touched on earlier regarding schoolwork, from oak galls and iron filings, a substance that needed to be mixed fresh with some regularity since it could thicken, separate, or simply dry out if left too long in its container. A quill pen, cut from a goose or occasionally a swan feather, required regular trimming and sharpening with a small, specific knife, unsurprisingly called a penknife, a term that has survived into the modern language for an object that now has almost nothing to do with pens at all, the original purpose behind the name mostly forgotten. Sealing wax closed the finished letter, melted with a candle flame and dripped onto the folded paper, then pressed with a signet ring or a small stamp bearing a personal design, both a practical measure to keep the letter's contents private during its journey, and a small, personal flourish, the specific design of a family's seal sometimes recognized instantly by friends and neighbors, the way a signature might be today. And then the letter needed an actual physical carrier, since there was no reliable centralized postal system reaching every corner of the colonies, the way you might assume. Some routes existed, official post riders carrying mail between major cities on a schedule, but reaching a more rural address often depended entirely on finding someone, a neighbor, a traveling merchant, a friend heading in roughly the right direction, willing to carry a letter the final stretch of its journey as a simple favor, meaning the actual arrival of correspondence carried an element of genuine chance that modern mail, whatever its own frustrations, rarely involves anymore. A woman writing to a husband away with the militia composed her letter knowing it might take weeks to arrive, might never arrive at all, and might, by the time it did reach him, describe circumstances at home that had already changed considerably by the date he finally read it, a strange kind of communication existing permanently a little bit out of sync with the present moment of either the writer or the reader, each letter a small message sent forward into an uncertain future, answered, if it was answered at all, by a reply that would itself take its own uncertain weeks to complete the return journey. Let me carry you to one more household before we settle fully back towards sleep, because there is a particular tension worth understanding that a great many colonial families lived inside that summer, one that most tellings of 1776 skip past entirely in favor of a simpler, more unified story of patriotic unity. Not every colonial family supported independence, and not every family that opposed British taxation policy believed the answer was armed rebellion. Picture a Quaker household in Philadelphia, a community whose religious convictions held pacifism as a genuinely central, non-negotiable principle, refusing to bear arms in the conflict on grounds of deep, sincerely held faith rather than any particular loyalty to the British Crown itself. Maybe here she is, the wife of a Quaker merchant, watching her own city fill with military preparation and revolutionary fervor that summer, while her family's faith held her and her husband apart from the fighting itself, a position that drew real suspicion and real social pressure from patriot neighbors who increasingly viewed neutrality itself as a kind of quiet betrayal of the cause. Quaker families in Philadelphia faced genuine hostility during this period, accused of secret loyalism simply for refusing to actively support the war. Some prominent Quaker men eventually arrested and exiled from the city by revolutionary authorities, specifically because their principled neutrality had become, in the tense political climate of the moment, indistinguishable in the eyes of suspicious neighbors from active disloyalty. This detail matters, I think, because it complicates the tidy, unified narrative that 1776 often gets flattened into. A whole colonial population apparently marching in lockstep toward a shared, obvious conclusion. The actual reality held genuine, sincere disagreement within colonial communities themselves. Families divided over strategy, over principle, over risk. Neighbors who had lived beside each other peacefully for decades, suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of a question that would, before the war's end, tear some of those relationships apart permanently. Loyalists, colonists who remained genuinely loyal to the British Crown and opposed independence entirely, made up a meaningful portion of the population in every single colony, and their daily life that summer carried its own specific fear, watching a revolutionary movement gain momentum around them, while their own convictions placed them, increasingly, on what would prove to be the losing, and in many communities, the genuinely dangerous side of a conflict that would eventually drive tens of thousands of loyalist families to flee the colonies entirely by the war's end, resettling in Canada, in Britain, or in other corners of the British Empire, an enormous, largely forgotten displacement running quietly alongside the more celebrated story of the Revolution's founding. Autumn, when it finally arrived that year, brought its own specific wartime urgency layered on top of the ordinary seasonal pressure of bringing in a harvest before frost and rain could damage it. With so many able-bodied men away with the militia or the newly formed Continental Army, harvest labor across the colonies fell even more heavily than usual on women, older children, and whatever hired or enslaved labor a household had access to. And colonial correspondence from this specific autumn is full of genuine anxiety about whether crops would be brought in successfully at all, given how many hands the war had pulled away from the fields at exactly the moment those fields most needed them. Communities responded, in many documented cases, with exactly the kind of cooperative labor sharing we discussed earlier regarding barn raisings and quilting bees, neighboring households pooling their remaining labor to bring in each family's harvest in sequence, moving from farm to farm across the surrounding countryside, a practical communal solution to a genuinely difficult wartime labor shortage that also, in its own way, strengthened the exact kind of neighborly bonds and mutual reliance that would help these same communities endure the considerably longer, harder years of war still lying ahead of them, that autumn, years none of them could yet know the true shape or length of. Before we ease all the way back down into sleep, I want to hand you a small handful of the stranger, more specific details from this world. The kind of thing that does not fit neatly into any single theme, but that I think genuinely deserves a place in tonight's story, because they are the details that make 1776 feel less like a date printed in a textbook, and more like a place actual people actually lived inside. Toothbrushes, in any form you would recognize, barely existed yet in the colonies, and the ones that did, imported from England at real expense, used bristles taken from the necks of hogs, set into a bone or wood handle, a genuinely uncomfortable-sounding object that most colonial households simply did without, relying instead on the rag and tooth powder method we already discussed. Umbrellas existed, but were considered, through much of this period, a somewhat unusual and even faintly suspect accessory for a man to carry, associated more with women or with a kind of delicate affectation that a properly rugged colonial gentleman was expected to shrug off in favor of simply getting wet. Ice, in the depths of winter, got cut in large blocks from frozen ponds and lakes, hauled to a specially built ice house, layered thickly with sawdust or straw for insulation, and preserved remarkably well into the following summer, allowing a genuinely wealthy household the rare, prized luxury of a cold drink, or even something resembling ice cream on a hot July evening, an almost unimaginable extravagance to a farm family who had never tasted anything colder than well water in their entire lives. Chocolate, interestingly, was consumed in this period almost exclusively as a hot drink rather than a solid confection, ground from cacao beans and mixed with hot water or milk, sweetened if sugar was available, a beverage genuinely fashionable enough among wealthier colonial households that specialized silver chocolate pots, distinct in shape from a teapot, appear regularly in the inventories of prosperous colonial homes. Umbrellas aside, weather itself received a kind of close, anxious daily attention that modern life, insulated by heated buildings and instant forecasts, has mostly lost. A colonial farmer read the sky the way you might check a phone, clouds, wind direction, the particular color of a sunset, the behavior of birds and livestock, all folded into an accumulated, largely unwritten body of weather knowledge passed down through direct observation across generations, genuinely more accurate in the specific short-term sense of predicting the next day or two than you might expect from a system with no scientific instruments involved at all. Time itself, that summer, existed in a genuinely fascinating patchwork, since the colonies had not yet standardized to any single unified time system, each town essentially setting its own local time according to the sun's position directly overhead, meaning noon in Boston and noon in a town only a short distance away might differ by several minutes, a discrepancy that mattered very little in a world where nobody was trying to coordinate a train schedule or a video call across that distance. But that stands as a small, genuine reminder of just how differently this era experienced something as basic and universal seeming as the hour of the day. And here is one final detail I find myself genuinely fond of. Left-handedness, in many colonial and broader 18th century households, was actively discouraged, sometimes forcibly corrected, children's left hands occasionally tied behind their backs during meals or writing lessons to force the use of the right hand instead, reflecting old, deeply embedded cultural and even religious associations between the left hand and something vaguely sinister or unlucky, a prejudice with roots stretching back centuries before the colonies even existed, and one that would, remarkably, persist in various forms well into the 20th century, long after 1776 had become nothing more than a date in a history book. Let's spend a little time too on the actual physical objects that filled a colonial household, because I think the sheer sparseness of it, compared to any modern home you have ever stood inside, is worth genuinely picturing rather than simply hearing described in passing. An ordinary farming family's main room held, in most cases, remarkably few pieces of furniture by modern standards, a table, several stools or benches, and perhaps one or two actual chairs reserved for the head of household or an honored guest, a chest or two for storing linens and clothing, since built-in closets simply did not exist in colonial home construction, and the bed itself, often the single most valuable piece of furniture the family owned, sometimes explicitly named and passed down in wills with a specificity that modern furniture rarely receives, the best bedstead, the second best bedstead, language that shows up again and again in surviving colonial probate records, precisely because a good bed represented such a genuinely significant portion of a family's total material wealth. A spinning wheel occupied a permanent, prominent place in nearly every household that could afford one. Its wooden wheel and spindle a familiar enough silhouette that it shows up repeatedly in the surviving art and imagery of the period, functioning almost as a visual shorthand for domestic industry itself. A cradle, simple and wooden, sometimes on rockers, held whichever infant currently occupied the household, passed down and reused across multiple children and sometimes multiple generations, worn smooth in places by decades of small hands and rocking motion. Cooking implements clustered around the hearth, the iron pots and trammels we already discussed, along with a scattering of wooden bowls, spoons and trenchers, flat wooden plates that predated widespread ceramic dish ownership among poorer and middling colonial families, a single trencher sometimes shared between two people at a meal, a practice that would strike a modern diner as strange, but that reflected genuine, sensible economy in a household where individual place settings for every family member represented real, unnecessary expense. Few households owned a looking glass, a genuine mirror, which was a real luxury item that many colonial households, particularly rural and less wealthy ones, simply did not own at all, meaning many colonial people had a considerably less frequent, less detailed sense of their own reflected appearance than any modern person, glimpsing themselves perhaps only in the surface of still water or a polished metal surface, an oddly intimate detail that changes, just slightly, how you might imagine a person's relationship to their own face and body in this era. Storage, more broadly, relied heavily on hooks, pegs, and shelves built directly into the walls and beams of the house itself. Clothing and tools hung rather than folded into drawers, since dedicated chests of drawers, while they certainly existed, remained a genuine luxury item concentrated mostly in wealthier households. The overall visual effect of an ordinary colonial main room, if you could actually stand inside one tonight, would likely strike you as strikingly bare by comparison to any modern living space. Dim, smoke tinged from years of hearth use staining the exposed wooden beams a deep, permanent brown, every single object in the room serving some direct, practical purpose, almost nothing present purely for decoration in the way a modern home fills itself with objects that exist simply because they are pleasant to look at. Pregnancy, in this world, unfolded without the steady stream of information a modern, expectant mother has access to. No scans, no scheduled checkups tracking growth week by week. A woman's own body and her own accumulated observation, along with the collected wisdom of the older women around her, mother-in-law, neighbors who had already borne children of their own, serving as the entire framework through which she understood what was happening inside her. Quickening, the first moment a woman actually felt fetal movement, usually sometime in the 4th or 5th month, carried genuine significance in this era, functioning almost as the real, felt confirmation of pregnancy in a way that a modern early test simply provides on a chemical strip within days of conception. Physical labor did not stop for pregnancy, not for most colonial women, not until genuinely close to delivery itself, and sometimes not even then. A pregnant woman continued cooking, cleaning, gardening, and caring for her existing children throughout most of her pregnancy, her body simply absorbing this additional strain alongside everything else already demanded of it. A continuity of labor that surviving letters and diaries from the period treat with a matter-of-fact tone that can feel almost startling to a modern reader accustomed to a culture that treats pregnancy as a period warranting genuine, structured rest and accommodation. Once a child arrived and survived its earliest, most precarious days, breastfeeding, in the overwhelming majority of colonial households, provided its primary nourishment, typically continuing for well over a year, sometimes considerably longer, partly for the genuine nutritional benefit, and partly because it offered a real, if imperfect, natural contraceptive effect that many colonial families, consciously or not, relied on to help space out successive pregnancies across a marriage that might otherwise produce a new infant nearly every single year. Wet nursing, hiring another woman to breastfeed a child in the mother's place, existed primarily among wealthier urban households, or in situations where a mother had died or was physically unable to nurse her own infant, a practice considerably less common among rural and middling colonial families, who generally viewed a mother nursing her own child as both the natural expectation and, quite practically, the option that cost nothing extra. Weaning, when it finally happened, followed no single fixed schedule, guided instead by the specific circumstances of each household, a new pregnancy sometimes hastening the process, a particularly difficult harvest year sometimes extending it, since a nursing infant, requiring less additional solid food, represented in some practical sense a slightly less expensive mouth to feed than a newly weaned toddler suddenly needing a full share of the household's limited food stores. Livestock, beyond the milking cow we have already spent considerable time with tonight, formed an essential backbone of nearly every rural colonial household's daily reality, and each animal on a colonial farm carried its own specific demands and its own specific value that shaped the family's daily choices in ways worth walking through properly. Pigs, genuinely central to colonial food security, required comparatively little daily attention through much of the year, often allowed to forage semi-wild through nearby woodland, fattened deliberately in the final weeks before the autumn slaughter on a more concentrated diet of corn and kitchen scraps. That autumn slaughter itself a genuinely major household event, drawing extended family and sometimes hired help for a full day of butchering, salting and smoking that would produce the bulk of a family's meat supply for the entire coming year. Sheep provided wool, the raw material behind so much of the spinning and weaving we discussed earlier, sheared once a year in late spring, a task requiring real skill to complete quickly and cleanly without injuring the animal, the raw fleece then needing to be washed, carded, meaning combed to align the fibers in preparation for spinning, before it could become usable thread at all, an entire additional layer of labor sitting invisibly behind every finished piece of wool clothing a family wore. Oxen and horses provided the actual muscle power behind plowing, hauling and transportation, representing, in most households, the single most valuable living asset the family possessed, genuinely more valuable in many cases than the land itself, since land without the animal power to work it produced considerably less value. Losing an ox or a plough horse to illness or injury constituted a genuine household crisis, sometimes forcing a family to borrow or hire a neighbor's animal at real cost, or in worse cases, to fall dangerously behind on planting or harvest timing that no amount of additional human labor alone could fully compensate for. Chickens, comparatively low maintenance and providing both eggs and, occasionally, meat, were tended most often by women and children specifically, their care considered, across most colonial communities, a distinctly female domestic responsibility rather than a male farming one, and the small income a woman might earn selling surplus eggs to a local shopkeeper or neighbor represented one of the few genuinely independent economic activities available to a married colonial woman, money that, depending on the specific household's customs, she might have some real personal discretion over, in a way her husband's larger agricultural income never quite offered her. Dogs served working purposes considerably more than purely companionable ones in most colonial households, herding livestock, guarding the property against predators and, less pleasantly, against the occasional human intruder, and assisting in hunting, though genuine affection for a family dog certainly existed too, surviving letters and diaries occasionally mentioning a beloved animal by name, with a warmth that reads as entirely familiar to any modern reader who has ever loved a dog of their own. Town governance, meanwhile, particularly across New England, involved ordinary men in civic participation to a degree genuinely unusual by the standards of the wider 18th century world. The New England town meeting, an institution already well over a century old by 1776, gathered eligible male residents, typically property-owning men, to vote directly on local matters, road maintenance, school funding, the hiring of a minister, in a format of direct democratic participation that stood in real contrast to the more distant, hierarchical governance structures common across most of Europe at the time. Women, notably, could not vote in these meetings, another instance of the same pattern we have returned to repeatedly tonight, women managing enormous practical responsibility within their households, while remaining formally excluded from the political structures governing the community those households belonged to. And yet these same town meetings, by 1776, had become the exact venue where revolutionary sentiment often crystallized most directly, ordinary farmers and tradesmen standing to voice opinions on colonial policy with a directness and a genuine expectation of being heard that would have seemed remarkable to an observer from almost anywhere else in the world at that moment in history. Let's drift for a moment into an entirely different season than the summer we have mostly been sitting inside tonight, because I think spring deserves its own small mention, if only because it carried a very particular, hopeful energy that colonial households across every region genuinely seemed to feel after a long winter's confinement. In New England specifically, late winter brought one of the more genuinely delightful seasonal rituals of the entire colonial calendar, sugaring, the tapping of maple trees for their sap, a practice colonial settlers had learnt directly from native peoples who had been producing maple sugar for many generations before any European ever arrived on this continent. A sugaring season lasted only a few precious weeks, timed to that narrow window of late winter when nights stayed reliably below freezing, while days warmed just enough for sap to actually run, a specific, unpredictable weather pattern that families watched for with real anticipation each year. Wooden spouts, called spiles, got driven into the trunk of a mature maple tree, sap collected in wooden buckets hung directly beneath, and then boiled down over an outdoor fire for hours, an enormous quantity of thin, barely sweet sap reducing, through slow patient boiling, into a small final quantity of genuinely rich syrup, or, boiled further still, into hard maple sugar that could be stored and used across the entire following year in place of the considerably more expensive imported cane sugar most colonial households relied on sparingly. This sugaring work, unlike so much of the labor we have discussed tonight, carried a genuinely festive quality. Families and neighbors gathering at the sugar camp together, children permitted the rare treat of tasting the thickening syrup straight from the boiling kettle, a sweet, warm reward after a long, hard winter that makes this particular seasonal tradition one of the more genuinely joyful threads running through colonial rural life. Planting season followed close behind, carrying its own specific mix of hope and real anxiety, since the entire year's food security depended on decisions made across just a few critical weeks: when exactly to plant, how much seed to risk on a first attempt versus holding some back in reserve against the possibility of a late frost destroying an early planting. Farmers watched the specific budding patterns of certain wild trees and plants as a kind of natural calendar, a folk knowledge system considerably more sophisticated than it might first sound, since these plants, responding to the same soil temperature and daylight conditions that mattered for crop germination, often provided a more locally accurate planting signal than any fixed calendar date ever could. The mud, too, deserves honest mention, because spring in most of the colonies meant weeks of genuinely difficult, thick, clinging mud, roads that had frozen solid through winter thawing into a nearly impassable muck that made travel, already slow and difficult by modern standards, considerably worse for a period lasting several weeks each year, a season some rural communities referred to, with a weary, affectionate humor, as simply mud season, a stretch of the year that tested patience and boots alike, and that most families were, by its end, thoroughly ready to see the back of. There is a version of 1776, and I suspect it is the version you carried with you before tonight, that exists almost entirely in rooms with tall windows and polished tables, powdered wigs, careful debate, a single famous signature moment repeated so many times in paintings and films that it has become, in the collective imagination, nearly the whole of what this year contains. That version is not wrong, exactly. It happened. Those rooms existed, those debates mattered enormously, and the document that came out of them would genuinely, eventually, reshape the world in ways those men in that room could not have fully anticipated, even as they argued over its precise wording. But it was never the whole story, and I think, if you have stayed with me this long tonight, you already understand why. For every hour spent in that particular room in Philadelphia, there were uncountable millions of hours spent that same year in rooms considerably smaller and considerably less remembered. A woman kneeling at a hearth in the dark, a girl spinning thread until her fingers ached, an enslaved mother finding some small private moment to hold her own child close before another day of stolen labor began, a midwife riding out through a cold night toward a farmhouse where a woman's life and her infant's life both hung on hands that had learnt their skill through nothing but years of direct, repeated experience. Those hours, multiplied across every single day of that year, across every colony, across every household regardless of its wealth or its politics or its position in a social order that granted some people enormous privilege and denied others almost everything, are what actually constituted the lived reality of 1776 for the overwhelming majority of the roughly 2.5 million people who called the 13 colonies home that summer. What I find myself genuinely moved by, thinking about all of this, is how much competence, how much quiet, unglamorous skill sat inside these ordinary households that history rarely bothered to record by name. A woman who could deliver a baby, treat a fever, spin and weave an entire family's clothing, manage a farm's books and labor in her husband's absence, and still find some small reserve of tenderness left over for a frightened child at the end of an 18-hour day, was operating, by any honest measure, at a level of sustained competence that would exhaust most modern people within a single week of trying to replicate it. History remembered the men who wrote the founding documents. It mostly forgot the women and the enslaved people and the ordinary working men whose daily unglamorous labor made the entire world those documents were written inside of possible at all. I don't say any of this to diminish what happened in that room in Philadelphia. I say it because I think a fuller, truer version of this year holds both things at once: the enormous political document and the enormous, largely unrecorded labor of everyone whose lives that document would eventually touch. And I think there is something worth honoring in finally, even 300 years later, giving some real unhurried attention to the second half of that story, the half that rarely got written down at all, the half that survives now, mostly in the objects these people left behind: a worn wooden trencher, a carefully mended quilt, a single surviving letter folded and sealed with wax, carried by hand across a distance that would take you or me a single afternoon to cover in a car, and that took them, that summer, a genuine uncertain journey of days. Mercy does not know, that particular night, what is still ahead of her. She does not know that the war her husband has marched off toward will stretch on for 7 more long years, considerably longer than anyone gathered that summer genuinely expected it to. She does not know whether her own farm will still be standing, untouched by the fighting, when it finally ends, or whether the winter 2 years from now will be harder than any she has yet lived through, harder even than the terrible one soldiers not so very far from her own farm would spend. That same war, in a place called Valley Forge, a name she has not yet heard and could not yet locate on any map even if she had. She does not know that the daughter sleeping beside her tonight will grow up to tell her own grandchildren about this exact summer, about a mother who kept a farm running alone through fear and shortage and uncertainty. A story that will outlive every single object in this small dark room by a margin of centuries. She knows only what tonight actually contains: the particular weight of her own tiredness, familiar and almost comfortable by now, worn into her body the way a path gets worn into a field by years of the same daily walking. The sound of her children's breathing, slow and even, somewhere close in the dark. The last low murmur of coals settling in the banked hearth. The fire she will wake before dawn and coax back to life all over again, the way she has done every single morning of her adult life, the way women in households not so very different from hers were doing that same night in Boston and Williamsburg and Charleston and 1,000 small towns and farms scattered between them, an entire continent of small fires being banked down for the night, ready to be called back to life again in just a few short hours. There is something, I think, genuinely worth carrying with you from all of this, long after tonight's particular details have faded the way most details from a bedtime story eventually do. It is this: an ordinary day, lived with care and competence and quiet endurance, by a person whose name history never bothered to record, is not a small thing simply because it went unrecorded. It was, for the person living it, the entire visible world, as real and as demanding and as occasionally unexpectedly sweet as anything happening in any grander room, on any grander stage, anywhere else that same day. Mercy's day mattered exactly as much as the day happening in Philadelphia that same July, not despite how thoroughly nobody would ever write it down, but simply because it was hers, fully lived, fully felt, from the cold dark hearth before dawn to this last quiet hour before sleep finally, gently, takes her to. There is one more figure worth pulling into tonight's story before we let it close, because she appears in nearly every colonial household we have walked through tonight without ever quite stepping into the center of the frame, and I think she deserves a moment there now. The grandmother, the older woman, sometimes a widow, sometimes simply advanced in years within a household still headed by her own husband, occupied a genuinely essential if quietly understated position inside colonial family life. She was, very often, the household's primary keeper of medical knowledge, the one whose accumulated decades of experience treating fevers and setting minor injuries and knowing exactly which herb addressed which complaint made her, in practice, the family's first and most trusted line of medical care long before any doctor was ever sent for. She minded the youngest children while their mothers' hands were occupied with heavier labor, told the stories that got passed down, and slowly altered across each retelling, and carried, in her own memory, a living record of the family's history stretching back further than any written document the household possessed. Her hands, by this stage of life, likely showed the accumulated visible toll of decades spent at exactly this kind of labor we have spent all night describing, joints thickened and stiffened by arthritis that no colonial remedy could genuinely ease, though willow bark tea, taken for its mild pain-relieving properties, offered at least some modest comfort on the hardest days. An unmarried woman past the usual age of marriage, sometimes called by the era's own somewhat unkind term, an old maid or a spinster, occupied a genuinely more precarious position within colonial society, since the entire economic and legal structure of the era assumed a woman's security flowed through marriage, through a husband's household and, eventually, his inheritance. A woman who never married, whether by choice, by circumstance, or by the simple demographic accident of living in a community where eligible men were scarce, often remained within a parent's or a sibling's household indefinitely, contributing her labor, her spinning and weaving skill in particular, considerably valuable in a household with several children of its own, in exchange for the security that household offered her in return. The very word spinster, in fact, traces its origin directly to this exact arrangement, an unmarried woman's labor at the spinning wheel having become, over generations of common usage, so thoroughly associated with her marital status that the occupation and the social category eventually fused into a single word, still carried in the language centuries after the specific economic arrangement that produced it has been almost entirely forgotten. Some unmarried women, particularly in port cities with a more diverse range of economic opportunity available, built genuinely independent lives outside this pattern entirely, running small shops, taking in sewing or laundry work, or, in a meaningful number of documented cases, working as school teachers for younger children in communities that permitted women to hold this particular role, a genuinely respectable, if modestly paid path toward a self-sufficient life that did not depend on marriage at all. These women existed in smaller numbers than their married counterparts, but they existed nonetheless, quiet evidence, if you look closely enough at the surviving records, that colonial womanhood, whatever its formal legal and social constraints, was never actually as uniform or as narrowly defined as its official rules might suggest. The house is fully quiet now. Somewhere outside, an owl calls once, twice, and falls silent again, the only sound moving through a darkness that holds nothing else, no distant traffic, no hum of electricity, no glow of a screen anywhere within perhaps 100 miles in any direction. Just this house, this family, this particular pocket of quiet breathing, set down inside a summer night in 1776, that felt, to the people actually lying inside it, exactly as ordinary and exactly as complete as tonight feels to you. Mercy's eyes have closed. Her hand still rests, out of pure habit, against the small shoulder of the child curled beside her, a touch she is barely aware of making any more after years of these same nights, the same gesture repeated so many hundreds of times that her body performs it now without any conscious thought at all, the way your own hand might find a familiar edge of blanket or pillow without your mind ever needing to direct it there. Her breathing has slowed. Whatever worry had been sitting with her in that quiet waking hour we spent with her earlier, the letter that had not yet come, the uncertain shape of the months still ahead, has loosened its grip, at least for tonight, enough to let sleep finally take her the rest of the way down. And here is where I want to leave her, and leave you too, because I think there is something genuinely worth carrying out of tonight's story and into whatever rest is waiting for you right now. Every single one of the people we spent this evening with, Mercy at her hearth, the fisherman's wife scanning the horizon for a returning boat, the enslaved woman finding some small stolen moment of tenderness with her own child at the end of a day that had given her nothing freely, the Quaker household holding its principled quiet apart from a war raging around it, the widow running her late husband's shop with a competence the law had never quite trusted her to possess while he was alive. Every one of them went to sleep that particular night not knowing how any of it would turn out. Not the war, not the harvest, not whether the child sleeping beside them would live to see adulthood, or whether the letter they had been waiting weeks for would finally arrive tomorrow, or whether it would never arrive at all. They slept anyway. They had to. There was another fire to light before dawn, another day of labour waiting on the other side of whatever rest the night actually managed to give them, and so they closed their eyes into an uncertainty every bit as real and every bit as unresolved as anything you might be carrying with you into sleep tonight, and they trusted, the way people across every single era of human history have had to trust, that the morning would arrive, that the fire would catch again, that whatever the day held would somehow get met and gotten through, the way every other day before it had somehow, eventually, gotten met and gotten through as well. That is not a small kind of courage, even though nobody in that farmhouse that night would have used a word so grand to describe it. It was simply Tuesday, or whatever day of the week it happened to be, another ordinary night folded into another ordinary life, and how that day now sits inside a year that history has decided to remember, a year with a number attached to it that gets taught in schools and printed on documents and set off with fireworks every single summer, would likely have struck Mercy herself as faintly strange if you could somehow have told her that night what her own small, unremarkable, exhausting, occasionally sweet day would eventually come to represent to people lying in the dark nearly 250 years later on the other side of a world she could not have imagined in any of its details, listening to a voice describe her hearth fire and her mended stockings and her one quiet hour of nighttime worry as though they mattered. They did matter. They still do. I think about this often, honestly, more than I probably should for someone whose job is technically just to research old things and describe them to you in the dark. There is a particular kind of humility that comes from spending real time with people history forgot to name, a humility that has nothing to do with feeling small and everything to do with feeling, instead, a kind of quiet, expansive connection to every single person who has ever gotten up in the dark to light a fire so that the people they loved could eat, could stay warm, could simply continue existing for one more ordinary day. That is not a colonial impulse. It is not even really a human impulse limited to any single century or continent. It is just what caring for other people has always, in every era, actually required, unglamorous and repetitive and largely unrecorded and genuinely, quietly, remarkable anyway. Somewhere in that Massachusetts fishing village, that same night, the fisherman's wife has finally seen the lantern of her husband's returning boat cut through the dark water toward shore, and whatever fear had been sitting in her chest all evening has finally, gratefully, released its grip, at least until the next voyage calls him away again. Somewhere in Philadelphia, the Quaker household has said its own quiet evening prayer, one that asks for peace rather than victory, a genuinely different kind of hope than the one filling most of the households around them that summer, but no less sincere for being different. Somewhere on a Virginia plantation, an enslaved woman has finally, after a day that gave her nothing willingly, found a single stolen hour beside her own sleeping child, and whatever small, fierce tenderness she manages to hold on to in that hour represents, in its own quiet way, a kind of resistance that no legal system of that era, for all its careful cruelty, ever fully succeeded in stamping out. And somewhere, in a war camp whose exact location the letters home rarely specified in enough detail for a worried family to picture clearly, a husband and a father and a son, cold and tired and probably more frightened than any surviving letter he wrote home would ever quite admit, has also, finally, found sleep, dreaming, if he dreams at all that particular night, not of independence or liberty or any of the grand abstract words that would eventually get carved onto monuments, but of exactly the kind of small, specific, achingly ordinary things a person actually misses when they are far from home, the particular sound of his own wife's voice, the weight of a sleeping child against his shoulder, a fire he did not have to build alone, a bed that was not simply the cold, hard ground. That is what this war, and this year, and every single year that history eventually decides to remember, was actually made of, underneath all the documents and the speeches and the dates you already knew before tonight began. It was made of people, ordinary and extraordinary, in exactly the same unremarkable, quietly heroic measure, doing what needed doing, carrying what needed carrying, and closing their eyes each night into an uncertain future they trusted, against real and reasonable doubt, would somehow still be worth waking up into. I hope, wherever you are right now, in whatever room and whatever city, and whatever particular shape your own ordinary day has taken today, that you can feel just a little of that same trust settling over you now too. You do not need to know exactly how tomorrow will unfold. Nobody in that farmhouse did either. You only need, tonight, to let this last stretch of quiet actually be quiet, to let your own breathing slow the way Mercy's did, the way that entire scattered continent of small banked fires did that night, each one trusting the coming morning to call it back to life again in its own good time. Before I let you rest fully, there is one more small figure worth including in tonight's story, because we have spent so much of this evening inside the daily lives of women that I do not want to close without also giving a moment to the children themselves, the way they actually experienced this particular strange year from the inside, since a child's understanding of a revolution unfolding around them looks nothing at all like an adult's. Maybe he is a boy of 9 or 10, old enough to help with real chores, young enough that the war still feels, to him, less like a genuine threat and more like an enormous, thrilling disruption to the ordinary boredom of farm labor. He has watched the militia drill on the town green, the ragged lines of local men, some of them his own uncles and neighbors, marching and turning and presenting arms under the direction of an officer who was, until recently, simply the man who ran the mill or kept the tavern. And there is something genuinely electric to a boy his age in watching ordinary men transform, even briefly and imperfectly, into soldiers. He plays at it himself afterward, gathering a handful of other boys from neighboring farms, marching them up and down a fence line with sticks shouldered like muskets, shouting commands he has half remembered from watching the real drill, entirely unaware, in the specific unguarded way only a child can be, of how genuinely frightening the actual thing he is imitating would prove to be for the men who eventually marched off to do it for real. He has also, though, absorbed more of the household's real anxiety than the adults around him probably realize, children in every era being considerably more perceptive of the emotional undercurrents in a house than the grown-ups inside it tend to give them credit for. He has noticed his mother's face when a rider passes through town with fresh news, the particular way she goes very still and very quiet before asking her questions, and he has learned, without anyone ever explaining it to him directly, that some questions are better not asked out loud, that some fears are meant to be carried privately by the adults in a household, rather than spoken across the supper table in front of the younger children. Missing his father, when his father is away with the militia, feels to him like the specific, uncomplicated ache a child feels missing a parent, not with the layered political understanding an adult carries, but simply as an ache, a missing weight at the head of the table, a missing voice reading aloud from the almanac on a quiet evening. And when a letter finally does arrive, he presses close to his mother's side while she reads it aloud, hungry for even the smallest detail, a description of camp food, a mention of a friend from town who is serving alongside his father, anything at all that makes the distant, abstract danger his father has walked into feel, for just a moment, a little more like the familiar, knowable man who used to lift him onto his shoulders at the harvest fair. Childhood, in other words, moved through this genuinely extraordinary year the same way it moves through every difficult year in every era, absorbing the fear of the adults around it in fragments and flashes, translating danger into play because play was the only language available for processing something too large to otherwise hold, and carrying, underneath all of it, the same simple, universal longing every child in every century has carried when someone they love is somewhere far away and cannot be reached. The longing simply to have them home again, safe, ordinary, present at the supper table where they belonged. There is a particular dish worth mentioning too, before we finally let the evening close, because it captures something essentially, specifically colonial that I have not quite managed to hand you yet tonight. Johnny cake, a simple flatbread made from cornmeal, water or milk, and a little salt, cooked directly on a hot griddle or sometimes on a board propped near the open fire, appears across nearly every colonial region and every economic class, from the poorest backcountry cabin to a genuinely wealthy Virginia plantation table, one of the very few foods that crossed those otherwise rigid class lines with almost no variation at all. Its name likely descends from journey cake, a reference to how well it travelled, dense and sturdy enough to survive a satchel or a saddlebag for days without spoiling, making it a genuine staple for anyone moving through the colonies on foot or horseback, a militiaman's ration as easily as a farmwife's quick breakfast. I find myself genuinely fond of this particular detail. The idea of a single humble food, cornmeal and water and a hot stone, feeding a wealthy planter's family in Virginia and a poor frontier household in the Carolina backcountry on the very same morning, prepared with the same basic method, tasting more or less the same in both households. One of the only things in this entire story tonight that did not divide sharply along the lines of wealth or status that shaped almost everything else we have discussed. There is something quietly comforting in that. A single simple food, humble and unglamorous, managing to feed an entire divided, unequal, uncertain world with something close to equal generosity. And it strikes me, thinking about that single humble cake shared so widely across such an unequal world, that this might be the truest small lesson tonight's whole long story has to offer. History likes to sort people neatly, the powerful and the powerless, the remembered and the forgotten, the wealthy household and the enslaved one, the loyalist and the patriot, and there is real important truth in those distinctions, truth we have spent this entire evening trying to honor rather than smooth over. But underneath all of that necessary sorting, there was still, every single morning, a shared human need for a fire lit before dawn, for bread or cornmeal cooked over it, for children fed and animals tended, and some small private hour, however brief, spent resting at the end of an impossibly long day. That shared, unglamorous rhythm ran underneath every single household we visited tonight, regardless of what side of history's dividing lines it happened to sit on. And I think there is something worth carrying forward from that, a reminder that ordinary daily care, the kind that rarely gets written into any history book at all, has always been the actual, quiet foundation everything else in human life gets built on top of. So let the light stay all the way down. Let the room around you hold the same kind of hush that finally, gently settled over that entire small colonial world once every fire had been banked and every door had been latched for the night. There is nothing left to figure out tonight, no task waiting on the other side of this moment, nothing this story is going to ask of you now except the simple, unremarkable, genuinely restorative act of letting yourself rest. Think, if you want something small to hold on to as you drift, of that one particular detail from earlier, the fire carrier walking through the dark streets of some small New England town, covered pot of embers in hand, going door to door before dawn to relight the households whose own coals had died out overnight. There is something almost tender in that image. A stranger, paid a modest fee, quietly making sure that no family in his town woke to a cold, dead hearth, carrying warmth forward through the dark on behalf of people who were, for those few hours, unable to carry it for themselves. Sleep is a little like that too, if you let it be. A quiet carrying forward, unattended, unearned in any effortful sense, simply given, the way that fire carrier gave his small portion of warmth to whichever house happened to need it most that particular morning. You do not need to hold on to any of the facts from tonight, the dates, the numbers, the specific names of the tools and the trades and the customs we walked through together. Let those settle wherever they settle in your memory, or let them go entirely. It genuinely does not matter either way. What I hope stays with you, longer than any single fact, is simply the feeling of having spent a few quiet hours inside someone else's ordinary day, a day that felt, to the person living it, exactly as full and exactly as complete as your own day felt to you before you found your way here tonight. That feeling, I think, is the actual gift history has to offer, considerably more than any date or any document ever really could. Not information, company, the strange, quiet comfort of realizing that someone, somewhere, in some other century entirely, once lay down tired at the end of an impossibly long day, worried about people they loved, uncertain about a future they could not see, and closed their eyes anyway, trusting the morning to come. It always did. It will again tomorrow, too, whatever tomorrow happens to hold for you. Rest now. Let your breathing find that same slow, even rhythm we left Mercy in, somewhere back in that quiet farmhouse, her hand still resting against her sleeping child's shoulder, the coals settling lower and lower under their blanket of ash, patient, banked, ready and waiting for whoever comes to wake them again. You do not have to be that person tonight. Tonight you only have to sleep. So close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and let this whole long story and this whole long day finally, gently come to rest. If you are still awake, still listening, let me leave you with just one last small picture before I go quiet myself. Somewhere back in that farmhouse, the very last coal has finally gone dark under its blanket of ash, and the whole house has settled into that specific, total stillness that only ever seems to arrive in the deepest hour of the night, the hour when even the owl outside has stopped calling, when the animals in the barn have long since gone still, when the entire small, unequal, uncertain world we spent tonight walking through has, for a few hours at least, simply stopped asking anything more of anyone inside it. That is the stillness I want to leave you in too, not the stillness of an ending exactly, since morning will come for both of us, hers and yours, in its own good time. Just the stillness of a day that has finally fully been allowed to be done. Wherever you are tonight, whatever room, whatever city, whatever hour has actually found you listening to this, I hope some small piece of that old, patient, banked-down quiet has made its way into your own room as well. You do not need to do anything else tonight. You do not need to solve anything, finish anything, or figure anything out before you are allowed to rest. That was true for Mercy, lying in the dark beside her sleeping children, with a war and a harvest and an uncertain future all sitting unresolved around her, and it is true for you too, whatever your own particular unresolved things happen to be tonight. They will still be there tomorrow, waiting, exactly as patient as that bed of grey ash under the coals, ready to be tended again once you have actually rested enough to meet them. So let this be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Not a fact, not a date, just the simple, quiet permission to stop for now. The fire is banked, the door is latched, the house is still, and you, wherever you are allowed, finally, completely, to close your eyes. Good night, friend.